Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's symposium. My name is Katherine Steinman. I'm Curator of Education here at the Georgia Museum of Art, and I'm excited to kick things off for today's virtual symposium. So before we get started, I just wanted to share some information about our run of show and our Zoom platform. So today's symposium will showcase research by graduate students in Dr. Kirin's Fall 2020 Art History seminar course. This graduate course and the resulting scholarship are focused on the exhibition Modernism Foretold, the Nadler collection of late antique art from Egypt, which is on view at the Georgia Museum of Art now through September 26, 2021. Today's symposium is divided into 3 sessions. We'll have 2 30-minute papers in each session. Dr. Katherine Marsengill is our Symposiarch for today's symposium, and she's going to be moderating questions for the speakers at the conclusion of each of the 3 sessions. And we'll also have some time for questions at the end of the overall program today. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. William Eiland, who is director of the Georgia Museum of Art, and he's going to give our welcoming remarks today. So thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Kellen, and good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the seminar, Modernism Foretold, with its eponymous title. Just a minute, I'll get the video back on. With its eponymous title taken directly from our current exhibition and catalog, a project we currently have on view in the Knox Gallery at the museum, with 55 Coptic-era objects from late antique Egypt. Certainly today's event springs from issues raised by the art and artifacts in this exhibition, but it is more. It is a testament to the perseverance, the life experiences, and the enthusiasm of the collector, Emanuel Nadler. We study then, with this exhibition, the objects as well as the collector. And as I said in the foreword to the catalog, Professor Kirin's essay in this volume offers a panoply of other opportunities for study and further research. He traces the history of the Nadler's collection while contextualizing it and the family in the narratives of Egyptian and European history. In so doing, he illustrates vividly the trials, the tribulations, the vicissitudes of an outstanding group of objects, singular in American collections, as they traveled from Berlin to Alexandria to Lausanne, and finally to the United States. He details not only their provenance, but also the routes taken to secure and protect them. His description of the Nadlers, their family history, and the origin and displacement of the collection is not only an intriguing story, but also a capsule of experiences in the social displacement, economic uncertainties, and political divisions that define and characterize both the 20th century and the early 21st. So this afternoon, we begin the seminar thanking the Nadlers for allowing us to exhibit the collection, as well as to Katherine Marsengill for her studies of the objects. And my final words today express in welcoming you my gratitude to Professor Kirin and to each of you for a seminar not bound by the disciplines of art history, but a true and worthy exemplar of intellectual and cultural history. So I welcome you all. I'd like to introduce very quickly, if you don't mind, Dr. Katherine Marsengill, who received both her bachelor's and master's degrees in art history from the University of Georgia, where Professor Kirin was her thesis advisor. She also has a master's degree with distinction and a doctoral degree from Princeton University. Her dissertation, Portraits and Icons Between Reality and Holiness in Byzantium, received the Jane Foggen Prize for Best Dissertation in the Department of Art and Archaeology. She is the author of Portraits and Icons Between Reality and Spirituality in Byzantine Art of 2013, and has several published articles on late antique art. This afternoon, she is acting as our Symposiarch and as moderator. So I give you Dr. Katherine Marsengill.
Hello, everyone. My thanks to William Eiland for your introduction. And I would also, of course, like to thank Dr. Asen Kirin for inviting me here today and all the students who participated in the seminar examining the Nadler collection of late antique Egyptian art. The collection is impressive. I had the pleasure of examining and working with all of the objects here in New York at their home. So I extend special thanks and gratitude to Emmanuel and Anna Nadler for their kindness and hospitality. And I have seen the exhibition in December. I had the pleasure of seeing it, and it absolutely does justice to these objects. It is an impressive exhibition that I am proud to have been one small part in. So as you have already heard, today's symposium is divided into 3 sections, each with 2 papers. In each session, we will wait until the end of both papers, and then I will invite the speakers to return for the question and answer session, which I will moderate. So we begin our talks today with these 2 papers that you see on the screen. Both of these papers explore objects from the Nadler collection in terms of their classical heritage within the context of visual culture, Christian visual culture. So our first paper is by Noah Dasinger, entitled Classical Content in a Non-Classical Form, the Nadler Leda and the Swan Relief and the Theory of Kunstwollen. And so I will turn it over to you now, Noah.
Thank you, Dr. Marsengill, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank Dr. Eiland and Dr. Steinman and the Georgia Museum of Art for hosting this exhibition, as well as Dr. Kirin for his suggestions, critique, and instruction during our Coptic seminar, which is where this paper comes from. So let's begin. Classical content in non-classical form, the Nadler Leda and the Swan Relief, and the Theory of Kunstwollen. The Nadler Leda and the Swan Relief presents the figure of Zeus in the guise of a swan, tucked between the legs of the reclining and entranced Leda. The bird has a short neck and rudimentary wings, while the figure of Leda is almost like a cartoon, rendered with exaggerated eyes and a disproportionate body. This paper deals with the Nadler relief, but there are several examples of the same subject from late antique Egypt. The narrative of Leda and the Swan was also a popular subject in the classical world, where mythological themes accompanied lifelike figural forms, notably manifested in a later relief from the British Museum. In this image, the swan, naturalistically sculpted, stands on Leda's bent knees, while the bird's elongated neck stretches around the head of the female figure. The proportions are accurate, and the scene is easily interpreted due to the convincing depiction of both figures and a composition that summarizes their placement in the narrative. The same applies to a near identical scene of Leda from a Roman oil lamp now in Munich, created in the 1st century CE. The figural forms and overall compositions of these 2 sculptures show a dramatic degree of technical difference as compared to the Nadler Leda and the Swan. In the late antique era, when sculpting a pagan theme, sophisticated content accompanied the high style of Greco-Roman visual culture. But based on the rudimentary figural forms, there is a prevailing theory surrounding late antique sculpture, suggesting that stylistic changes from the high classical period are the product of artistic decline. This theory is often disproven since naturalistic imagery appears in objects created as late as 400 CE, when lifelike figural representation was supposedly no longer a widespread phenomenon. Commissioned by 2 Roman patrician families, the Samaki and Nicomachi diptych dates to the late 4th century, and in contrast to the decline in form argument, the figures are sculpted with commensurable and naturalistic bodily proportions, accompanied by a polished high relief. Another example, the Asclepius and Hygeia diptych, commissioned to honor the Symposium of their Saturnalia celebrations, contains the same concepts expressed in the Samaki and Nicomachi diptych, associating naturalism with the traditions of Roman paganism. Yet, despite the mythological similarities, the Nadler Leda was sculpted in such a different way. To fully comprehend this issue, we must address one of the earliest sculptures that manifest the decline in form of late antique visual culture, providing us with a foundation for why this theory applies to the Nadler relief from Coptic Egypt. The Arch of Constantine, erected in 315 CE, has been the primary sculptural example of the paradoxical forms and stylistic predilections of late antique sculptors. Prevalent in 19th century scholarship, but first promulgated by Raphael in his letter to Pope Leo X, the theory of late antique decline formed a significant section of stylistic grievances surrounding the arch's sculptural forms, emphasizing the lack of naturalistic technique, otherwise known as maniera or manner of form, comparing the Constantinian reliefs to earlier classical reliefs utilized as spolia. Quote, architecture was observed and maintained with good method into late antiquity and on one and the same maniera as before. This was the last of the arts to be lost, and one could recognize this from many examples, among them the Arch of Constantine, the composition of which is well executed in every respect, having to do with architecture, but the sculptures on the same arch are utterly clumsy, bereft of art or any decent design. Those that came from the spoils of Trajan and Antonius Pius are excellent and of perfect maniera, end quote. The late antique Constantinian frieze below the arch's attic register undoubtedly lacks Roman naturalistic refinement. Many scholars, particularly Bernard Berenson, argue that these Constantinian reliefs epitomize the formal shortcomings of the majority, if not all, the Roman artisans who did not have the skill or intellect to sculpt lifelike representations. The arch offers evidence to the contrary, since many of the spoliated reliefs are recarved by 4th century sculptors with the naturalistic facial features of Constantine. For instance, in the Hadrianic roundel, the boar hunt, Hadrian's head was recarved to resemble Constantine and naturally rendered to conform to the rest of the relief. However, despite the apparent skill and naturalistic technique of late antique sculptors, Raphael and subsequently other scholars, including Berenson's treatment of the arch, focused on stylistic evaluations based on the refinement and criteria of what came before, mainly classical antiquity. In view of this, is it possible that the style of the Constantinian reliefs manifests a deliberate stylistic choice that fulfilled a specific function in the context of early 14th century visual culture? The theory of Kunstfallen, formulated by Alois Riegel, a late 19th century social philosopher and historian, is another approach to interpreting the late antique sculpture. The term refers to art as the organic product of its contemporary environment and defined by Riegel as, quote, a teleological approach, according to which I saw in the work of art the result of a specific and consciously purposeful artistic will that comes through in a battle against function, raw material, and technique. In this theory, the latter three factors no longer have the positive creative role that the so-called Symposium theory gave them, but rather a limiting negative one. They constitute, as it were, the coefficients of friction within the whole. Riegel, in his explanations of Kunstfallen, focused on the Arch of Constantine's simplified figural form, claiming that the 4th century reliefs characterized by two-dimensional picture planes, squashed figural proportions, and lack of refined detail emphasized Constantine as military leader and emperor of Rome, following his conquest of the city. Politically, Constantine was an outsider to Rome's aristocracy, and the construction of a triumphal arch and the content of the reliefs proved to the traditional Roman leadership that he was an elite citizen capable of ruling the empire. The figural forms were secondary to the allegorical purpose. Going even further, H.P. Larange argued that the Constantinian reliefs reflected the formal shortcomings related to the tetrarchal portraits from the reign of Diocletian, particularly the Vatican II Caesars. If we look at this sculpture from the perspective of Kunstfallen, we come to understand the allegorical intent behind a lack of naturalism. The overall message is the figural embrace, highlighting the partnership of 4 distinct men promoting their allegiance to one another and the empire. Naturalism, in this particular cultural and historical context, was not as important as reflecting the idea that even though Diocletian split the empire into 4 separate sections, something that the 3rd century Roman had never experienced, it was ultimately the right decision. The tetrarchal sculptures present the spectator with allegories of unity and security, easily distinguished by the simplified form. The same applies to Imperial Egypt, where tetrarchal portraits were predominantly sculpted and displayed. Discovered in the 19th century, a fresco of the first tetrarchy, painted by members of an imperial cult at the Pharaonic temple of Luxor, is indeed similar to sculpted versions of the same scene from late antiquity. Represented with identical iconography, Diocletian, Maximius, Galerius, and Constantinus Chlorus embraced one another in contrapasso, holding orbs in their right hands. The figural embrace and the inclusion of the globus references the imperial division of Emperor Diocletian, focusing on the collaboration of these four rulers. The figures are, of course, simplistic. None of the tetrarchs embody an individual pose or gesture. However, that is not the overall message. The allegorical implications of these frescoes match the intentions of the sculpted versions of the tetrarchy located around the Mediterranean. The form is a subsection of the primary political and cultural ramifications of the period, using a simplified yet profoundly interpretive technique that is indeed similar to sculpture from late antique Egypt. Coptic sculpture, like Egyptian tetrarchal portraits, is often discussed as a simplified art form and categorized as folk art due to its lack of naturalism. It is also frequently compared to previous and later epochs, disregarding its allegorical impact. However, Kunstwallen is perhaps the key to understanding Coptic sculpture and the Nadler laid in the swan relief. Although imagery sculpted on the Arch of Constantine highlights the emperor's current political achievements, the same methodology derived from Regal's theories can be applied to other imagery in the late antique period, such as Coptic mythological sculpture. By the 3rd century, Egypt was dealing with conflicting notions of religious self-identification following the legalization of Christianity and the ongoing promotion of classical Greco-Roman ideals. We can conclude that Egyptian society was highly eclectic. Their visual culture would in turn reflect those ideas, presenting an ambiguously allegorical mythological subject with a simplified figural form to promote a Christian interpretation. Furthermore, the sculpture's patron, perhaps a Christian matron due to the composition's intimate nature, must have required a narrative that employed an ambiguous theme to properly communicate a Christian allegory to a spectator, since Coptic Egypt was culturally diverse. Thus, the relief is, at face value, both pagan and Christian, relating to the cultural class of two different religions and lifestyles that confronted the late antique Egyptian, but ultimately Christian due to context. Relevant to this discussion, since it obscured and complicated the study of Coptic sculpture, Merit Boutros Ghali, writing under the Islamic regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser, proposed that Coptic sculpture was folk art, made by a distinct group of Egyptians who were not a part of Greco-Roman society, or at least chose to exclude themselves from the Hellenic traditions. However, this interpretation has since been rejected, proposing that Egyptian Christians were in fact a part of wealthy Roman society, but unsurprisingly, not a part of the Roman patrician class. Copts were not a group of isolated agrarians, and neither was their visual culture. It was more sophisticated than simple folk art, and to appear affluent and educated, they would have received a wealthy Roman education, placing Coptic sculpture out of the category of simplistic and rudimentary. Typically, wealthy Romans, whether that was in Egypt or the rest of Europe, sought after the teaching of the Hellenic Greeks. Their visual culture, based on their teachings typically reflected the naturalistic forms associated with the earlier classical period. For instance, Byzantine Emperor Julian the Apostate spent much of his early life in Greece, learning the pagan traditions of the Hellenistic world, and was often described as a philosopher rather than an emperor. His artistic and religious patronage followed his philosophical predilections, grounded in his early classical teachings. Moreover, Julian's successor, Theodosius I, was also captivated by the classical world, and his artistic patronage reflected those Greco-Roman values. The Missorium of Theodosius, cast in 388 CE, marked the decennalia of Theodosius' reign, and the small tray created for the event contains classical motifs accompanied by naturalistic figural forms. The emperor sits under an antique-styled ciborium, while the figure of Terra, goddess of the earth, reclines with little putti flying around her body. To the left and right of Theodosius are the two Caesars, the emperor's second in command. Their bodies are smaller than the emperor, but due to a hierarchy of scale, they still appear commensurable. The same applies to the figure of Terra, suggesting that the use and patronage of naturalistic figural forms was associated with the Roman patrician class. In Egypt, these same class notions associated with Coptic visual culture also impacted late antique patronage and stylistic tendencies. Despite the lack of written evidence about affluent Copts, the life of St. Anthony of Egypt is an example of how the same Roman ideas on wealthy education dominated upper-class society. Anthony was born into a wealthy landowning Christian family that would have educated their son following the decorum of upper-class society. And in the 3rd century CE, Roman teachings were at the top of the ladder. Although, according to St. Athanasius of Alexandria, education was not his forte. Quote, he could not endure to learn letters, not caring to associate with other boys, but all his desire was, as it was written of Jacob, to live a plain man at home. End quote. Regardless of whether Anthony delighted in his early education, it still involved learning letters, which refers to traditional Roman teaching methods, specifically the classical teachings of the patrician class. His early writings, similar to the philosophical and artistic patronage of Julian and Theodosius, were also written in Greek, the language of education in the upper class. Even St. Athanasius, Anthony's first biographer, wrote in the same language. Accordingly, naturalism, much like the Greek language, was the high style of the Greco-Roman past. The figural forms would thus reflect the class that patronized the work, and what we define as Coptic art was in fact not folk art. And we can assume that the basic and unrefined style of the Nadler, Leda, and the Swan relief comes from a well-to-do patron, but not a Roman patrician. Shifting our attention to the impact of location. In late antiquity, figural sculpture in Egyptian necropolis, or in a Christian context, koimiteria, associated the deceased with a certain religious or context or some other aspect of their lives. These sculptures helped the visitor interact with the deceased and provided a visual stimulus to the interred's life and interests. However, it is paradoxical for a Christian to have pagan imagery in a tomb. The ancient city of Heracleopolis Magna, or Anhas el Medina in Arabic, is an important place to approach the complexity of early Christian burial sites. Discovered by Edward Naville in the late 19th century, one of the most interesting finds was a small structure that contains the foundations of a narthex and an apse on opposite sides. Naville originally claimed that the structure was a Christian chapel, but based on the studies of Hijal Mortor, it was later reinterpreted as a Christian mausoleum that contained pagan reliefs of Orpheus, Hercules, and Leda. The Anhas, Leda, and the Swan reflecting the style of other Coptic reliefs of Leda and Zeus from late antiquity, features the resting figure of Leda and a large swan with an aggressive and almost determined facial expression situated between the woman's legs. The Nadler, Leda, and the Swan was sculpted with the same figural arrangement in a more simplified form, but the allegorical allusions related to style are apparent. We do not know where it was sculpted or exactly where it was found, but since most finds come from Christian funerary structures, we can conclude that the relief fits a similar purpose, perhaps symbolizing a paragon of feminine virtue, since by the 4th century, Egypt was predominantly Christian. Traditionally, in Greco-Roman and Egyptian culture, images of birds and religious deities held a number of different interpretations. Depictions of Leda and the Swan were indeed abundant, but their relationship to Christianity is somewhat confusing. Reliefs of Leda, raped by Zeus, contained an erotic aspect in Roman visual culture. Bestiality depicted on Roman oil lamps was a common trend, and depictions of Leda generally related to some sexual connotation connected to uncontrolled desire. This sexual carryover would not be appropriate in a Christian funerary context, but since the relief was found in a funerary chapel, it must have had a Christian allegory. It could have been a salacious scene dedicated to sexual intimacy or a new narrative related to loyalty and companionship. The relief more than likely represented the union of husband and wife, since Coptic Christians often cited Zeus as an example of passionate love, since he transformed into a swan in order to fulfill his desire for Leda. Quote, bridegroom, may your wedding be filled with the dancing of the graces, with gently nurtured roses, with honey-sweet grape clusters. You are marrying a bride who is an inviolable Ariadne, and fittingly, you have found her nobility of descent. Suddenly, today, a light has filled these our houses, because dear young Matthew has taken a bride. May you have the love of wisdom with Hera to bless your marriage. Like gold, you have found your golden bride, both of you like heroes. She is as ripe as a honeycomb. Bridegroom, bend your mind to love. Zeus, himself in heaven, because of Europa's beauty, is known to have become a bull. For Leda, he was esteemed a swan. Although early Coptic scholarship argued that a Christian interpretation was out of scope, the sculpture must have been a Christian image due to context. It was made for a Christian in a private funerary structure, but in terms of actual reception, those notions varied based on the different cultural ideas of the late antique Egyptian, since in this period, Egypt was dealing with seemingly diametrically opposed cultures that were now combined into one single identification. Thus, the allegorical implications of Christian companionship between husband and wife were easily interpreted to the style and importation of the pagan narrative. But overall, the spectator would have understood that it was a Christian image due to its location in a funerary mausoleum. Hence, a wealthy Christian matron valued the mythological and Christian allegories associated with the simplified style and intimate narrative of Leda and the Swan, placing a mythological narrative in a personal Christian funerary structure. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Hello again. Thank you, Noah, for this fascinating paper on the Nadler collections, Leda and Swan. Its style within the context of late antique Coptic art, how it might be considered an erotic subject matter, and yet was used by Christians in their funerary monuments, and the social significance that had. If there are questions, please type them in the Q&A, and we will come back to Noah after our second speaker, who is coming up next. Tara Kraft has written a paper entitled Tangled Symbols, Exploring Sexuality and Sacred Space Through Late Antique Egyptian Hairpins, the ivory hairpin from the Nadler collection. So I will turn it over to Tara.
Thank you, Dr. Marsengill, for the introduction. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Kirin for his very patient guidance on this paper and throughout our research process as we were working on these projects last semester. So the title of my talk today is Tangled Symbols, Exploring Sexuality and Sacred Space in Late Antique Egyptian Hairpins. Hairstyling has played an important role and female dress for centuries, but in late antiquity, the binding of hair was also a way to show one's age, marriage status, wealthiness, rank in society, and a woman's virtue. While Mediterranean cultures like the Greeks, Romans, Jews, and Egyptians varied in many aspects of their day-to-day lives, their approach to hair, specifically women's hair, was consistent in the requirement of binding and veils. In Greco-Roman culture, unbound and unveiled hair marked eligible young women by indicating fertility and unfettered sexuality. Since the styling of hair was a mark of civilization, it also delineated between citizen and foreigner. Jewish culture also required the binding and veiling of hair, but here it marked the quality of a woman, whether married or not. The importance of these decorum standards was enforced through religion by both deities, as in sculptural representation of goddesses in Greco-Roman society, as well as in ritual practice, like can be seen in the shrouding of holy objects within the Temple of Jerusalem. In cosmopolitan centers like Alexandria, Egypt, these cultures would have mixed, influencing the way women's hair was viewed, treated, and utilized as a metaphor of power and containment, of sexuality and moral purity, of sacred space and reality. One physical commonality between all of these four cultures, however, is the use of the hairpin as a part of female adornment and a tool for upholding societal standards. Ranging in intricacy of embellishment and material, examples from late antique Egypt are abundant, but none exhibit as delicate carving as the Nadler pin with its elaborate finial, architectural elements, and unambiguous Christian symbolism. Whether a simple chignon or an elaborate coiffure, all styling required the use of a hairpin to maintain its shape. While hairpins served a specific utilitarian function, they also fulfilled an important symbolic one. Social customs and religious beliefs across these different Mediterranean cultures reflect the importance of the head as a vital life source. Hair, as an extension of this, was endowed with ritual significance. However, women's hair was also was feared as much as it was revered. Hairpins were used by cultures where everyday accidents were explained by unseen forces like the evil eye, and as such, these common daily objects go beyond their pragmatic function to serve as protective amulets well after Christianity becomes an official religion. Comparing the iconography of the Nadler pin with other surviving examples demonstrates the entanglement between Christian and pagan beliefs in late antique Egypt. Used to hold hairstyles in place and secure fabric, the carvings on finial of hairpins served a functional purpose by maintaining proper tension on the hair, ensuring that the pin would not slide out once put in place. In addition, these embellished portions also served as amulets that protected the wearer from unseen forces by recalling sacred space, deities, or protective motifs. Carved decoration served an important role by reinforcing the sacredness of space associated with the head, hair, and heavens, beginning with secular imagery in Rome and moving into Christian context with the Nadler pin. Although Coptic hairpins are usually non-figural, it is important to understand the function figural pins served in Roman society in order to appreciate the symbolism carved into Egyptian examples. Believed to have been created for a wealthier patron due to its detailed carving, this Roman hairpin with a finial male bust is made of bone and measures 4 inches in length. Created between the 1st and 4th century, the figure is frontally positioned with eyes carved in a downcast manner, recalling a reverent posture. Chiseled using downward waving lines, the figure's hair ends at a circular band resembling a crown or wreath. In particular, the rendering of the hair and its band mirror representations of the Greco-Roman god Apollo, representative of the sun and healing. This deity would have been a powerful token of protection and divine blessing. Therefore, while the pin's physical function secures the hair of the person wearing it, it also serves or fulfills a spiritual purpose by bringing healing and light to life through the evocation of sacred beings in close proximity to the sacred space of the head. Figural hairpins depicted female deities as well, as can be seen in another Roman example, also made of bone and measuring 4 inches in length, made between the 2nd and 3rd century. Mirroring the Apollo pin, the hairpin, the female bust's eyes are turned downward, indicative of prayer, which is further emphasized by the visible downward tilt of the head. Rendering the dress and hair in similar fashion to one another, the artist uses trough-like cuts to delineate between fabric folds and curls. Using this technique for the woman's hair, the depiction mirrors larger sculptural depictions of Persephone, whose hair is traditionally carved in a similar manner. Both Persephone and her Roman equivalent Proserpina, goddesses of fertility, had popular cults during the period of this hairpin's creation. Acting as a potential devotional tool then, the pin could have been worn during performance of specific mysteries or daily routines to invoke divine blessing, especially with the many dangers associated with maternity and childbirth. As Christianity grew in popularity, early sermons spoke out against the use of such symbolism being attributed to everyday objects, but did not disclaim the powers people were trying to shield themselves from. Rather, church officials used magic and its negative connotations as a way to encourage participation in church rituals, specifically the Eucharist, which was purported as being the only way to truly protect oneself against magic. The abundance of Coptic hairpins in wood illustrates that the middle to lower classes not only used hairpins, but also infused them with symbolic powers. One of the main shifts from Roman examples to Egyptian, in addition to medium, is the transition from figural to animal representations. Flat and carved in an almost silhouette fashion, these 4-inch long hairpins are dated for the 5th or 6th century and favor the rooster along with a dot and circle motif. While the rooster could be emblematic of Apollo or his son Aesculapius, it also played an important role in the story of the crucifixion, specifically in reference to Peter's denial of Christ. Consequently, the animal serves a notable function in funerary and living and funerary rites by acting as an acknowledgement of Christ's call and the individual's response to it. The ability of the hairpin to serve both the living and the dead as an amulet, coupled with the versatility of the rooster symbol, illustrates the power infused into these daily objects and the trust placed in their capability to protect, guide, and bless. In addition to the rooster, Coptic hairpins favor this dot and circle motif, which was believed to protect against the evil eye. Prevalent cross-culturally, this deep and tangible fear associated with unseen forces acted as a way to explain natural occurrences like accidents, illness, deformation, or unexpected death. Since anyone could potentially wield the power of the evil eye, protective measures were taken very seriously. One of these remedies was the use of the dot and circle symbol, which, like an eye, was infused with special power believed to redirect spells back on their sender. Whether harnessed for good or evil, magic was formidable and prevalent, and like female hair, it was widely revered and feared. When Christianity began to expand and overtake local and state cults, this faith and magic was unable to be rooted out. Rather, it became an active part of Christian beliefs. Placing Christian doctrine above the local practices required that the church create and infuse iconography like the dot and circle and figural representations with the power to deflect harm. Combining ritual and sacred space, the icons chosen to serve this purpose demonstrate through layered symbolism the entanglement of religious beliefs in late antiquity. The finest example of this entanglement can be seen in the Nadler hairpin. Made of ivory and measuring 9 inches in length, it is longer and more delicately carved than surviving examples. Topped with a Greek cross, a domed ciborium is supported by a hollow circle that resembles the dot and circle motif found on earlier pins. The ciborium served both pagan and Christian purposes, but in neither construction is empty space visible underneath it, especially within the church, as this would have broken its connection between the heavenly realm and the world below. The hollowed circle then is not a stylized rendition of interior space, nor a part of the pattern that follows. Believed to have been created in Alexandria, the pin is an important example of carving, craft, and everyday adornment in late antique Egypt, though its medium and exquisite detail point to its patron as part of the upper class. Compared to the Coptic hairpins discussed above, the iconography is distinct in its evocation of Christian space and the power from which the pin could aid its wearer. However, the combination of pagan and Christian iconography and its embellishment illustrates the complex relationship between these faiths by combining the strongest evocations of power from both. Delineating sacred space within the church, the ciborium was a 4-pillared structure topped with a dome that, like the veil for the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple, marked areas within the church such as the altar, baptismal pools, sacred icons, venerated objects, and the tombs of saints. The two most popular uses of the ciborium were over the altar where the rites of the Eucharist were celebrated and over baptismal pools. Intrinsic to the Christian faith, these two rites signified a rebirth of the individual. Along with demarking holy space, the ciborium also recalled biblical architecture. Used in this context, the canopy served as a portal, transporting the healing, power, or sanctity of a specific place and story out of its original literary context and infusing it into the physical space where the ciborium stood, allowing individuals to partake of the same benefits spoken of within the scriptures. Therefore, the structure becomes a tangible representation of the space where the divine and mortal meet, a physical and visual connection between the spiritual and earthly realms. While the ciborium was widely used within churches, this was not the first time people would have encountered this type of architecture, nor the purpose that it served. The use of canopies evolved from the Greek funerary tradition of marking graves of heroic men, a practice continued in the Roman Empire with the use of mausolea. Furthermore, Constantine commissioned a ciborium to be constructed over St. Peter's tomb in Rome as early as the 4th century. And although the original was replaced by Bernini in the 17th century, an engraving of the purported original is found on a marriage chest from the 5th century. And both the use of Solomonic columns are present, which are rumored to have been taken from the Temple of Jerusalem and moved to Rome by Constantine himself. These columns are recreated in micro fashion to support the ciborium of the Nadler pin, illustrating the importance of the apostle, the church, and the quotation of sacred spaces. Since the ciborium was familiar in the daily practice of worship and veneration for secular and Christian culture alike, it is not surprising that this formula was adopted as an emblem of protection and power for the amulet purpose of the hairpin. Furthermore, since the structure was typically over a grave and marking a place of worship to the dead, placing the Eucharist, the body and blood of a crucified Christ, within this structure fit existent religious practices of the time. Subsequently, just as pagan and Christian rites warped and entangled with one another, the symbolism that implied these actions did as well. Coptic Christology placed special emphasis on the rituals surrounding acceptance into the church. Two specific rites were the baptism and the taking of the Eucharist, with both creating a transformation in the human body that signaled an individual separation from their previous life and their new identity within Christ. While the Eucharist was offered as the only way to protect oneself against magic, the conviction that there was magic to be protected from is still pagan, therefore creating a continued use and need for amulets well after the adoption of Christianity. Since both baptism and the Eucharist were performed under a ciborium, the Nadler hairpin captures the power of these rites for the protection of its wearer. Combining the ability of the Eucharist to deflect evil with the magical properties associated with amulets and hairpins, the Nadler's pin iconography becomes a forceful message of religious sovereignty and its ability to protect the people. Since belief in the evil eye did not stop with the advent of Christianity and its rituals, the dot and circle motif is included underneath the ciborium on the pin as a second protective layer. Consequently, the symbolism of this everyday object calls into question the traditional narrative and timeline of the Christian faith and its polytheistic forebears by combining the two into a single item that would have been used frequently, seen by many, and understood by all. In addition, the depiction of a ciborium on the Nadler pin would not have been the first time this architectural form had been rendered in microfashion for use outside of its liturgical setting. Rather, small renditions of the ciborium would have been used in processions or to serve the Eucharist to large congregations, acting as an extension of the main structure that stood within the church. Like the ciborium acted as a portal of biblical architecture, the microciborium extended that portal, creating a mobile edition that could travel with the wearer throughout their daily routine. As a result, the individual becomes the sacred space rather than the area of the church, transferring the power from inanimate to animate, from architectural to figural. In addition to the veil, this fluidity of the ciborium outside of its ecclesiastical purpose elevated the hair of late antique women from a physical attribute to a powerful sacred space. The distinctly religious symbolism carved into the Nadler hairpin is uncommon both in surviving examples of pins as well as in combs used for religious rituals. Extending into the liturgy itself, this fear of divine intervention and its destruction was prevalent. Consequently, liturgical combs served a specific ritualistic purpose by protecting the priest's mind through the action of combing prior to donning the vestments for Mass. This action was believed to remove any demons that might be trying to infiltrate his thoughts. Early combs were traditionally two-sided, with one end of regular spaced teeth and one with tightly packed, similar to contemporary knit combs. Documentation of head lice and the measures used to keep them at bay are as rampant as the parasite itself, ranging from oils to shaving of the scalp. While these symbols were believed to be the power behind the removal of evil, in reality, it was the close teeth of the comb itself that temporarily removed the irritation. Combing the hair with something such as this would have removed the droppings and carcasses of dead lice, as well as temporarily dislodging living ones from the scalp, and doing so, the general symptom of a crawling sensation and the intense itching would have been removed, an event easily comparable to removing demons from one's mind. Like hairpins, combs were made of various media ranging from ivory to wood, and similar to the majority of Coptic hairpins, organic shapes and motifs seem preferred over direct religious symbolism. The wooden comb, believed to be of Coptic origin, created around the 6th century, is longer rather than wide, with a pattern of dot and circle motifs scattered over the handle. Slightly off-center, these dots make the shape of a Greek cross, referencing its use in a liturgical setting, but also maintaining an ambiguous presence like the rooster hairpins discussed earlier. Combining the dot and circle motif with the use of the comb in a liturgical setting further exemplifies the interwoven beliefs that existed both in everyday practice and in church rituals. To better understand the practical use of the Nadler pen in conjunction with its significant iconography, one must return to the initial examination of cross-cultural requirements for veiling in late antiquity, specifically those of the Jewish culture. The use of a veil in Jewish culture mirrored its use within religious circumstances. Acting as an evaluation of purity and virtue, the veil delineated between respectable women and those involved in acts of sexual promiscuity outside of the temple, while within the veils demarked the holiest of space. In addition to wearing a veil, the creation of it also served an influential role in the appraisal of a woman's value. Second only to childbearing, the creation of textiles, from spinning to weaving, was considered a feminine craft, domestic in nature and practice. A woman's ability to partake in this craft was considered a virtue, adding a symbolic connection to the use of the veil by combining the spiritual purity of sacred space from the temple with that of creation, both in terms of fecundity and textiles. Further emphasizing the sanctity placed on textile production is the story of the Virgin Mary and the purple wool. Prior to her miraculous conception of Christ, the Virgin is gifted the wool by Gabriel and the angel Gabriel in order to weave a new veil for the temple. This new veil prophesies the coming of royalty that would sacrifice themselves for the Jewish people as Christ, King of Kings. Following the crucifixion, this veil in the temple is purported to have torn in two, symbolizing that an old covenant had been broken and a new one put in its place. Therefore, while Jewish women wore veils mirroring the sacred space of their temple, the use of veils in Christian context would be challenged, a fact supported by Paul's insistence in multiple letters to the early church that women should remain modest and covered in public. The importance of this myth is illustrated by the Nadler pen and its quoting of Solomonic columns supporting the Symposium, which draws special significance by evoking a biblical portal between not only the Holy Center in Rome and Jerusalem, but by connecting the wearer of the pen to the Virgin's contribution to the temple. Using this feature created a spiritual connection between the woman wearing the pen and the Virgin herself. Judging by the length of the Nadler pen, it was used to secure the veil from the outside, as its longer length would have allowed ample room to fasten fabric. And keeping with concerns of the evil eye, the pen would then have acted as a warning or a protection against those who posed a potential threat to the wearer, but it would have also signaled the virtue of the woman who wore it. In the 8th century, at the rise of iconoclasm, objects with powerful iconography like the Nadler hairpin saw a decline in use and popularity. By removing the power from the hands of the people and the infusion of it into their daily routines, the church and government solidified its place as authority and protector, drawing the power of symbols back into the physical space of the church. Hairpins created after the 8th century see a decline in representational form and a shift in material, the latter of which could be due to changes in geographical location. Furthermore, alongside the rise of iconoclasm begins the superstitions and distrust of magic. Although the late antique world is believed to have made a clear, definitive shift in religious beliefs and practices at the introduction of Christianity, the Nadler pen and its combination of evil eye remedies, the ciborium, and the dot and circle motif demonstrate the interwoven beliefs of pagan and Christian religion that were used by late antique Egyptians to explain the natural occurrences happening around them. Bridging the sacred and the malevolent, the amuletic hairpin offered protection, sanctuary, and virtue through evocations of sacred space. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thank you, Tara. This was a very interesting paper on the Nadler ivory, the truly exceptional Nadler ivory pen. It is an exceptional example, and it's entirely unique as far as I was able to find. This paper really shows us how Christian imagery found its way onto items of everyday use, especially in late antiquity, and how these items that were used to adorn the body were actually used also to protect the body. And as you rightly point out, this was a period in history when perceived presence of evil magic, evil supernatural forces like demons and so on were universally acknowledged as real threats to good Christians. So I think you did a very nice job tying those things together. I would like to invite, of course, Noah to come back onto the screen as well, so we can have some questions. I have one, but it's not quite done yet. So, you know, what I would do is I will go ahead and ask a couple of questions that I had. Noah, as your paper points out, it's really fascinating that these objects that are ostensibly pagan and were first interpreted to be pagan have turned out to be used by Christians, and we're admitting more and more, it's becoming more and more discussed by scholars, that these kinds of mixes of Christian and pagan things were happening, and that Christians, people who would call themselves Christians, were using images of pagan mythology. Of course, we always knew that, as you also point out, we always knew that when it came to things like Theodosius, the large silver plate that you showed, and so on. But you did a very nice job demonstrating how these patrons in Coptic Egypt or late antique Egypt were educated and were aware of their choices, and how we should judge these examples as mere folk art based on style. That style was also mutable, changeable according to the context, such as Constantine's arch. You mentioned briefly that there were points of engagement, that these images, that these objects, reliefs, were points of engagement with the deceased at the tombs. And in the case of this deceased person in her tomb, it was probably a Christian matron, who, if not portrayed, is represented here. And I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on how the function of Leda and the Swan might work for Christians in this Christian funerary context, but not just what it means, but how did what did viewers make of it? How did viewers, come to approach it? How did they view it? How did it function in that context?
I would say that the approach is based on the kind of eclecticism of Egyptians at this time. And so if you were to approach this funerary structure and see the image, if you are a traditional Greco-Roman and you've studied that, then you would approach it from a traditional Greco-Roman standpoint. And if you were now a Coptic Christian, you would approach it from a Christian standpoint, because you would understand, but both would come together and understand that it had to be Christian because of its placement. There's no denying that it might be a mythological subject, but it has no placement here within this tomb. So the idea would be that you would be able to interact with the deceased life, the idea of with the mythological scene, because you would understand the allegories of Leda and the Swan. But at the same time, you would, if you were a Christian, you would understand the allegories of Christian husband and wife companionship. So you'd be able to combine those to come to the conclusion that it has to be Christian because of context. Even if you weren't a Christian, or even if you weren't Greco-Roman, you would understand the simple allegory of companionship.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Thelma K. Thomas's book talks about these kinds of images being more allegorical in terms of divinity and human relations. But what you're saying is that it could also be indicative of a good wife. Is that different from her point, like more of a mortal relationship, the social meaning of that? Could you talk about that?
I think it could be indicative of the mortal as well, but as well as what Thelma K. Thomas talks about is the idea of, in terms of a Christian standpoint, being a good husband and good companion is a divine, something you should be divinely, worried about, and something you should do. So in a divine sense, that you could connect that with, immortality or a sort of divine nature. It just, I guess, is more about the viewer itself, because it's so ambiguous and so strange how it's a mythological subject in a Christian space. And so what does that go through, and how ambiguous it is, and how it would connect to either side of whether you're pagan or Christian. And so it's just the ambiguous of the narrative could help you, portray many different things, but ultimately Christianity, in a sense, whether it's divine or mortal, because of its context.
Here is a question for Noah. I was wondering if the Leda and the Swan, who frankly has a face more like an eagle than a swan, could be a reference to vice, not only to husband and wife. I think of how vices were often brought into Christian panels.
That's a good question. Let's see. In terms of vice, it is interesting that the figure does not look like a person. It does look like a sort of eagle with a kind of beak in a sort of sense. But in terms of vice, that is a good question, because if they're pulling a Christian interpretation, you could see the vice of the woman, or the vice of, Leda's and this kind of sexual act within this context. But it does seem strange, because if it's for a private funerary structure, why would you want to talk bad about, just put down the person in the structure through the imagery? So it's a weird thing, and there's, it's hard to put a real pin in what is the actual correct interpretation, which is why it's so difficult to figure out what's going on here at times.
I think you did a very nice job of having the comparison of the other Leda and the Swan panel and knowing where that came from, whereas the Nadler Leda, we don't know where it comes from. So we're just trying to make a relationship in terms of that. But I think that's a very good point as far as Vice goes, that this is a, a place, a tomb where you go visit someone, and there are, of course, ancestor veneration rituals that go along with that. So you don't want to cast them in a bad light. A question for Tara. I love your paper. I was curious if you explored the symbolic functions of materials here. I think you're right to point to magical properties in the iconography and the hybridity. And I would think that, wait, my screen just shifted. I would think that the multimedia, gold, ivory, wood, etc., would have contributed to this symbolism to which you pointed. You mentioned the elite versus the hoi polloi in material in terms of cost, elite versus the hoi polloi in terms of the material, but could there also be a symbolic function to the material itself?
Thank you for the question. As far as looking at the symbolism of the material itself, I will admit I didn't necessarily follow that much further than just seeing how that material spoke of what context it was used in, whether it was used in more of the lower to middle classes or the upper classes for patronage. But it is very possible that it could. From what I did look at as far in terms of the material itself, the ivory is probably symbolic of just that upper class and closer to the more divine aspect in a way, but as far as the other bone or some of the other hairpins that come later are gold or silver, I didn't necessarily follow that into that kind of idea of the material being a symbol in itself, just kind of focusing on the iconography.
I may be able to add a little bit to your answer in terms of the material. I do know that in antiquity, ivory and gold are considered the most of the divine materials. I mean, obviously they're most expensive, but you have the great cult statues of antiquity, of classical era Greece being done in ivory, and it symbolizes purity and it symbolizes all of these other things, so that you have these materials, gold and ivory, being kind of the first ranks of material used for divinity. And then you have the other bronze and wood and stone, kind of following behind it. So ivory, of course, is premier, not only in terms of cost, but also in terms of what it means. So ivory is definitely, this was a wealthy woman who owned this pin for sure. Tara, here's another question for you. Just a curiosity for Tara, did you come across images of how hairpins would have secured a veil? I'm having a hard time envisioning it fastening fabric and where it would be placed. Would a second ring piece have been used?
So there are very few images that show a hairpin in use at all. And so the two that I included in the PowerPoint early on where they're securing the hair itself are among the very few where the hairpin is actually being shown in use. But just from a slightly more professional standpoint of securing hair, that would have been tucked into a part of the hair, a style itself. So if they had a band coming back of the hair being tucked into a bun in the back or into a chignon in the back, then the hairpin between the tension of the finial itself and the tension of the hair, that would have held the veil in place. So it wouldn't have necessarily gone through the veil, but just kind of held the tucked veil into the hair, if that makes sense.
It does. I'm going to go to the very top because I missed a question at the top. These were excellent papers. I wonder if Dr. Marsengill could explain whether these students' research build on hers or whether they offer alternative interpretations to those of your catalog. And I will just say that the catalog, I tried very much to stick to description with only a little bit, and possibly places of origins if I could decide where they could be from. I mean, when I wrote the catalog, of course, we had very, very, very little information about any of these objects to go on. So just creating, determining the subjects, the objects, what they were probably used for, and any kind of comparative material was the goal. And so Noah's interpretation of Leda, we have the other examples that he showed him, and I don't believe I wrote too much. I think Noah really took it off with that and did much more than I even hinted at. And as far as the hairpin, well, at first it wasn't really identifiable as a hairpin. There's so few. The ones that exist are not nearly as large as the Nadler ivory one, which is, I think it's 12 or 14 inches long. It's quite a substantial, beautiful object, and there is nothing that I found that's comparative for it. So just determining that it's a hairpin was important, and then just describing it. So as far as describing all the different ways that it could be used and the significance of the imagery, Tara really took that and ran with it too. I didn't go anywhere into that. So I want to thank you both for that. There is another question. I think we have time, so I'll go ahead and do it. Second question for Tara. I loved your reference to the woman wearer as becoming a sacred space, and you made a good juxtaposition with the Virgin. Would you push this a step further by saying the object imbues or reinforces the woman wearer as the sacred space, like the Virgin Mary's womb as the Theotokos? Just a thought based on your great research, great job. And I will add just something to that so that you can have a chance to maybe do both. This is I think you showed very well that this is an object that, in terms of its magical properties, really is a woman who wants to cover her bases. She's operating in with some pagan imagery, if these dot and circle technique motif is to be taken as that, and also the use of the ciborium, but in the cross. But the ciborium as the cover, usually most often at this time, the cover of these very sacred spaces of baptism or the altar. This seems particularly presumptuous to me for her to wear this. And I was wondering if this says something about well, first of all, do we have any comparisons of people who are making these things that look, framing their sacred space and making them into sacred spaces, either through the use of garments or other decorations? If you have other examples of that, and also pointing out to the audience as well that we have a lot of church fathers at the time who were really upset by these people who are using Christian images, but especially figural imagery and narrative scenes on their bodies, on their clothing, on their jewelry, and so on, and I guess also on their hairpins, which makes it, they were upset to see this. They were walking around like churches. I think this is what one church father said. They were displaying themselves like the walls of churches, and he was, of course, chalking it up to pride and display of wealth as well. So I was wondering if you had something that you could say to who this woman was, if you think she's presumptuous, or if she's fitting in with the other kinds of images that could be seen. And then, obviously the original question having to do with marking off your own body as a sacred space. And this person also wants to know, of course, about a direct comparison of herself to the Virgin Mary.
So I think for the first part of that question and taking it a step further, the way I kind of followed this into this conclusion is really by looking at the Jewish culture, which is where Christianity kind of came out of a little bit. And they do look at the Christian faith adopts the Torah itself as the Old Testament in addition to the New Testament, books that they create into the New Testament. And so Jewish culture saw this use of the veil as a mark of virtue and the mark of a good woman, if you will. And so I don't know that she's necessarily drawing a comparison that she is putting herself on equal ground with the Virgin herself, but just saying that she has the similar virtue. And so a way to maybe illustrate that better is to go back to that story of the Virgin Mary and the purple wool. She's chosen to do that veil as she's in direct lineage of the line of David, and she's the most pure, emblematic woman in Jerusalem that is coming from that line, and they were the only ones in this story that were able to weave the new veil for the temple. And so it might be kind of just a way to separate oneself and kind of put oneself up on a pedestal to a point, just to say that, you know, I'm pure, I'm very virtuous, as a separation, but not necessarily on the same level as the Virgin herself, if that is helpful. And then to Dr. Marsengill's question about it being a little presumptuous, it does feel a little presumptuous and quoting an ecclesiastical space so directly, or even just a sacred space like that directly. But I think one of the things that kept coming back to me, and some of the other research that's been done on this idea of veiling, is there are passages in some of the letters that Paul writes to the new church about women not standing up and participating in church rituals and in church stuff within the church as leadership roles. And so I almost wonder if this is a statement to say that she is able to participate in those roles, or because she is on that same level of virtue.
That would be fascinating if we could come up with any kind of evidence for that, but that would be fascinating. There is one final question. I think we'll take it since we're running a little bit early, and it's for Noah. Can you speak to the probable viewing distance and elevation of the relief and contextualize possible mythological pairings or juxtaposition with the pagan and Christian imagery? So I guess since we don't know specifically for the Nadler, if you have any examples of what kind of images were seen next to one another, and how, at what viewing point a viewer would be positioned in relation to such an image.
Yes, thank you for the question. The Nadler relief is actually, it might look large on the PowerPoint. It looks like the size of a sarcophagus. It's actually small. So it's actually about, it looks like a band that would go across the top maybe of a sort of funerary mausoleum. And I know that the Anhas Leda in this one was juxtaposed with imagery of Leda, Orpheus, and Hercules. So it was in a way, the most, I guess, what we would consider the most stereotypical Christian imagery associated with Roman paganism. So it had, because Hercules comes back from the underworld, much like Christ, as well as the same Orpheus was able to go and travel the underworld and then make it back. And so Leda would fit in that context with the idea of perhaps believing in Christ and believing in his resurrection, while at the same time another personal aspect, as well as a divine aspect, is keeping with a good marriage, as well as being a good companion on mortal earth, and then how that would help you in the next, heaven. In terms of distance, the Anhas Leda was found I think the structure was pretty much destroyed, but the foundations were there. And so they found it around the area. So it wasn't on the wall or anything like that. So we don't really know where it was displayed or exactly how the viewing distance was. But I would say it's a small structure, so it wouldn't be too tall nor too wide. So wherever you were, you would probably view it in terms of associating it with the deceased, whether that be in a sarcophagus or in the tomb itself and mummified, or however in Egypt, I'm not quite sure about their burial practices, but the idea is that you would associate that image with the deceased. And so unfortunately, we just don't know, because we don't know where the Nadler was found, and as well as the Anhas was not on the wall. It was only a fragment found on the ground, as well as the foundation under archaeological excavation. So it's tough to say.
Thank you very much, both of you. I think that is a long enough time to make you sit there and take questions. So let's take a break. I think we should start the second session now. It's 2:20. So welcome back to our second session and the symposium. This session, we have two more papers that present research on Christian context of imagery and subjects that had been, again, used by pagans, but were transformed for their new roles. And so once again, we will allow both speakers to present, and then we'll invite them back for the Q&A at the end. Our first paper is by Alex Hathaway, examining the capitals of the Nadler collection. It's entitled "The Christianization of the Classical Architectural Orders, Column and Pilaster Capitals in the Nadler Collection." So thank you, Alex.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Professor Kirin and the Georgia Museum of Art for inviting me to speak about the Nadler collection. This paper looks at how the classical architectural orders were Christianized in the late antique and early Byzantine periods, so that we can understand better the appearance of the 5 capital and pilaster pieces in the Nadler collection. So first, I'd like to begin with a brief introduction to the pieces, and we will come back to them at the end for a more thorough look. The Nadler capitals display features clearly recognizable as belonging to the classical orders, but have additional elements and stylistic changes that are fully new. The marble capital with eagle and crosses on the left resembles the classical Corinthian order, but is more stylized with new iconography. Likewise, the capital on the right has a new basket shape and ornamentation, but is rooted in a classical capital. The Nadler collection also has 3 pilaster capitals, one with a face coming out of leaves of acanthus, one with a central grapevine, and one with 2 birds. All show the addition of new iconography to a classical form. Although we cannot be certain about the original display context of the majority of the capitals, they likely served an ecclesiastical or funerary function, and the iconography of these architectural elements allows us to gain insight into the culture of this period. Overall, the 5 capitals are obviously unlike in many ways, but they also have a clear connection. They all show very different forms from the traditional classical orders that dominated Greco-Roman society. The aim of this paper then is to contextualize the Nadler collection in the broader framework of Christianization. First, we will look briefly at why there was a need to Christianize the architectural orders, and second, how Christianization was achieved, or what Christian innovations were added to the classical orders in practice. As we will see, the underlying motivations for the Christianization of the classical orders are not only a general fear of paganism, but the need to claim the heavenly realm for Christianity alone. And the architectural manifestation of Christian identity is achieved visually in 3 main ways. First, the use of impost blocks, second, stylistic changes, and third, the addition of Christian iconography. As very brief background, the mixture of traditional pagan forms and Christian symbols, like those seen on the Nadler capitals, was common in the visual culture of the early centuries of Christianity. The burgeoning religion had a complicated relationship with Greco-Roman paganism, and at times Christians rail against this heritage. Statues of pagan gods and emperors are destroyed to show Christian triumph over paganism, or they are otherwise prominently marked with the sign of the cross as a way to bridge Christianity with its cultural past. Over time, as Christianity's status is no longer threatened, a more dispassionate approach is possible. The use of spolia declines as temples are cleansed with the inscription of the cross, and more economically, they're converted into churches instead of being looted or destroyed. Besides the fear of paganism, the Christianization of the architectural orders occurs because the verticality of architectural space becomes particularly important symbolically. Early in Christian thought, the supporting function of columns takes on symbolic meaning and becomes associated with the apostles. Textual evidence supports this interpretation. Galatians makes references to apostles as columns. Ephesians states that the church is built on the foundations of the apostles, and Revelation describes the wall of heavenly Jerusalem containing 12 foundations, each with the name of an apostle. In the Old Testament, the Proverbs of Solomon begins with a parable of wisdom building her house using 7 pillars, which the New Testament book of James names as 7 characteristics for a pious individual, such as purity and humility. The meaning of this connection is clear. Through their character and deeds, the apostles supported Jesus Christ, spread his teachings, and laid the foundations for Christianity to blossom. They symbolically support the heavenly realm represented by the upper architectural elements in the church. In a different respect, columns can act as a bridge between the earthly and the heavenly realms. In ancient Rome, the triumphal column may represent a predecessor of this concept. Take the column of Trajan, which was topped with a statue of the deified emperor, where an individual could climb the column through an interior staircase and in some ways experience the emperor's transition from human to God. In Christianity, the comparable experience is most fully realized in the case of Saint Simeon of Syria, the Stylite saint, who isolated himself atop a pillar for 36 years in order to pursue spiritual goals. Those who came to seek guidance from Simeon understood him as residing in the heavenly realm atop his pillar. Although Christianity was not the first religion to have a cosmic understanding of its religious architecture, the Stylites manifest Christianity's exclusive claim to the heavenly realm. Not only is the column a symbol of the apostles, it also stands as the threshold between the earthly and heavenly realms in the Christian church. The climbing of pillars had been practiced in some pagan cult rituals, but in those cases, the climbers tried to position themselves as close as possible to the heavenly realm. Saint Simeon and other Stylites bring an important nuance to this symbolism. Climbing the pillar, they are at the threshold, not reaching for it. And so the importance of the architectural capital at the threshold of heaven becomes incredibly important for Christianity. Now let's turn our attention to the visual manifestations of Christianization in the realm of the classical architectural orders. The capital is the most recognizable and representative feature of each order, and architects of Christian churches have a challenge to alter capitals in a way that retains some of their classical elegance, but is also wholly Christian. The Christian identity is subsequently manifested in the capital in a few ways. First, the use of impost blocks, which are a feature of some late imperial buildings, but become closely associated with Christian churches. In their standard form, they appear as an inverted truncated pyramid, with the larger end usually supporting the springing of an arch and the smaller end connecting to the column capital. Some scholars view them not only as structural pieces for arches, but as a way to purify pagan architecture. In an age that still feared paganism, the use of an impost block with a triumphal cross inscribed, like those in both of the images here, helped to negate any fears relating to the use of the classical orders in a Christian church. As Christianity solidifies its political and spiritual dominance in the age of Justinian I, impost blocks become less likely to have the inscribed cross. Next, we turn to stylistic changes that significantly contribute to the departure from the classical orders. As the capitals are Christianized, they begin to shift away from the classical appearance, retaining an understanding of the structure of ancient Greek and Roman forms, but reducing them to ideograms and ornaments. The example from Greece on the left shows stylization between the acanthus leaves, similar to the Nadler capital with eagle and crosses. Often, this abstraction is expressed in patterns that are rooted in naturalism. Rounded basket capitals, which often showcase detailed surface patterns based on leaf decoration, are a classic example, like the Egyptian capital here on the right. And along with abstraction, dematerialization of form becomes a common motif, not only in capital decoration, but in church architecture overall. Sculptors begin to rely heavily on the drill to create deep undercutting of forms and to contrast areas of light and shadow. In doing so, they reduce the three-dimensionality of the sculpture, creating a surface that often relies on patterns. The achievements made in capital decoration using these new techniques could be interpreted in a couple of ways. First, their surface carving is notably skilled and gives a feeling of luxury appropriate for their context. Second, the undercutting plays on the materiality of the capital, often providing a lace-like effect that makes the capital seem lightweight and not made of stone. It seems contradictory that the capital supports the weight of the ceiling above, which adds to its symbolic effect and stresses the notion of the heavenly over the earthly and the invisible over the visible. Christianity regularly plays on the dichotomy of the perceptible and imperceptible worlds, and architecture responds to this through massive structures that seem to float, to be airy or light, or to have some other aspect that affirms that the divine presence contributes to their stability. Lastly, and most recognizably to the majority of us, Christianization is visually enacted through Christian iconography. Christian literary and visual culture is immersed in symbolism, and much of the visual iconography has underlying references in the Old and New Testament literature. Although Christian iconography encompasses a wide array of symbols, those most often found on column capitals can be categorized broadly as crosses, flora, and fauna. Let's first look at the cross, which is the most important symbol in Christianity. As we have already seen, Christians understood the cross to hold apotropaic properties, so it was used to cleanse pagan temples and their spolia. The cross has many forms. Most familiar is probably the Latin cross, with the long vertical bar and the shorter horizontal bar, representative of Christ's crucifixion and sacrifice for humanity. The Greek cross, with its 4 equal arms, can be understood as focusing more on Christ's divinity than the sacrificial aspect of the Latin cross. The inscription of the cross inside a wreath is related to the pagan laurel wreath. In Greco-Roman depictions, winged Nike or genii are depicted with outstretched arms, holding a round wreath of laurel to crown a victor. In this example, the laurel wreath contains a cross, and the winged figures are now understood as angels. The symbolism here is a straightforward borrowing from paganism. Christ is victorious over death, over sin, over other religions as the savior of mankind. Besides the cross, nature and garden features are abundant, and in general, they are representative of paradise. The natural abundance of the Nile and its fame across the Mediterranean leads to nilotic representations of animals, aquatic life, and vegetation that serve the same role as gardens to represent paradise as well as earthly prosperity. At Sinai and the monastery of St. Catherine, an original 6th century roof beam, which is here on the right on your screen, shows nilotic scenes nilotic scenes. The Christian paradise is rooted here in local Egyptian imagery, highlighting the flexibility of Christian visual culture. Popular flora imagery include an array of flowers and plants, many with several meanings. The palm, for instance, can represent victory, ascension, regeneration, and immortality, while the lily is associated with purity and the Virgin Mary. The grapevine is an extremely common motif imported from Dionysian imagery and tied to Old Testament and New Testament scripture, where Christ says, "I am the vine, you are the branches." The grapevine also has straightforward connections to the Eucharist through the symbolic drinking of wine as the blood of Christ. The most popular plant motif, of course, is the acanthus leaf. It retains much of the Greco-Roman symbolism of abundance, rebirth, and immortality. A notable variation of it is the so-called windblown acanthus. In these versions, like the image on the right, the acanthus leaf appears to be pushed to the side by a wind. This variation not only plays on the materiality of the stone, giving it lifelike movement, it also recalls liturgical fans, the breezes of paradise, and several psalms that describe wind as the carrier of divine messages, as well as God himself. Animal and bird motifs are also seen in capital iconography very often. The ram and lamb are symbols of Christ and his followers. The deer, like those seen on the San Vitale impost blocks on the left, usually signify a convert preparing for baptism. Birds are also common and have numerous interpretations. From pre-Christian times, they have been viewed as symbols of the human soul, but certain birds have other connotations. The dove represents the Holy Spirit in Christianity, while a peacock, a common representative of paradise, stands for immortality. Of all bird symbols, the eagle may have the clearest heritage. An eagle is an age-old symbol of Zeus and later comes to stand for Roman power. For Christianity, the eagle can represent good triumphing over evil, and so is a symbol for Christ. As it was thought to be the highest flying bird, the eagle became joined to Christ's ascension to heaven. This high flyer connotation was extended to the followers of Christ as well, who would be able to reach the heights of heaven through their piety and their following of Christ's teachings. Lastly, some iconographic motifs are important, but fall outside of these three main categories that I've listed. Most notably, figures are seen in sepulchral and private capital decor. The practice was popular in late antiquity, often displaying individuals who would be present in the heavenly realm. Common figural motifs include gods, masks, and in a sepulchral context, the deceased. The example on the right with the masks has similarities with both the Nadler pilaster with the face coming out of the acanthus, as well as the pilaster with the grapevine. The choice of style and iconographic representation on capital decor can often be interpreted as visualizing a heavenly paradise, which is understandable in the context of the vertical hierarchy. Paradise was a part of heaven that was potentially accessible to the devout viewer standing on the church floor below. It was the liminal heavenly space occupied by the stylites who then became saints. Much of the iconography used in Christianized capitals is therefore representative of paradise, Christ, and his followers. It highlights that Christ is the path for a follower to reach this heavenly paradise, one sanctioned, protected, and claimed by the Christian God as represented by the image of the cross. Now, a return to the Nadler collection allows for a richer understanding of the high-quality learned pictorial programs on display there. The marble capital with eagle and crosses can now be understood as showcasing a miniature iconographic program. As the viewer circles the capital, the Latin cross reminds the viewer of Christ's sacrifice through the crucifixion. The floral motif of two leaves can be viewed as grapevine or ivy, referencing Christ's sacrifice as well as hinting to his resurrection. The eagle with open wings recalls Christ's rise to heaven, the ascension, and the Greek cross inscribed in a wreath reinforces Christ's victory over death. Through the polyvalent aspects of these symbols, the viewer is also reminded of the dual nature of Christ, his mortal life on earth and the cross, and his immortal life in heaven. The eagle can additionally remind the viewer of the pious follower who, like Christ, can reach heaven after death. Similarly, the grapevine reinforces for the viewer the importance of following Christ in order to reach heaven. Below, the acanthus leaves emphasize the rebirth or immortality imagery, and the stylization highlights the shift from the physical to the spiritual and the importance of the symbolism used in the crosses and eagle above. In terms of context, the marble capital is appropriate for a church or a monastery. It provides a recognizable connection to classical building techniques while illustrating immediately understandable differences through the base that is stylized. It has more to offer to the more attentive viewer, a solemn contemplation of foundational elements of Christian theology. The limestone basket capital, so different in first appearance from the marble capital, can now be understood as the product of a similar religious understanding. The shape itself of this capital can be seen as a dramatic departure from classical form. Although its shape may have evolved from traditional forms, the rounded basket capital is a wholly Christian design. At the top of the capital, the viewer can understand the palmette bosses, which are nestled in a bed of acanthus, as symbols of victory and immortality, which in the context of a church or monastery can be applied to Christ. Below, the prominent rosettes are reminding of the flora of paradise, with the stylization and prominent drill work that contrasts light and shadow, again focusing on the spiritual world over the earthly one. The three smaller pilaster capitals, likely reserved for sepulchral architecture, use similar imagery. First, we return to the pilaster with the figure rising out of the acanthus. As discussed, the inclusion of gods, masks, and the deceased on column capitals was popular in late antiquity. In this pilaster, the female figure is open to interpretation. She may be the image of a deceased woman, but based on similar depictions of other figures with this particular necklace, the figure is likely a goddess, perhaps Gaia, who invokes overall well-being, or Daphne, the beloved of Apollo. Within the acanthus motif, a sense of abundance and rebirth is present that complements either identification of the figure. The two other pilasters are more directly Christian. In the pilaster with the grapevine, the vine is prominently centrally depicted and reminds the viewer of the necessity of following Christ's teachings. The viewer would also see in the vine Christ's sacrifice, which is remembered through the Eucharistic wine and the liturgy, and his subsequent resurrection. Although the boss at top is damaged, a wing appears to be present. If it were an eagle, it could be appropriately understood as Christ's ascension to heaven after his sacrifice, or it could be understood as the followers of Christ, which supports the scriptural reference to Christ's followers as vine branches. The flanking acanthus again brings thoughts of rebirth, immortality, and prosperity. The egg and dart motif below, a classical architectural motif of life and death, supports the iconography above. The last pilaster provides the clearest example of paradise. The two birds can be understood as souls of followers who have ascended to paradise through their piety. The three lotus pods in the center of the composition, like other lilies and flowers, have associations with purity that reinforce the qualities needed to reach paradise. In a sepulchral context, the emphasis on paradise is understandable as the hope for the final resting place of the deceased. The stylization and contrast of light and dark from the winding of leaves and stems provides some measure of abstraction and dematerialization, which adds to the spiritual focus of the scene of paradise. In sum, late antique and early Byzantine Christians made a concerted effort to claim the heavenly realm through their sculptural choices for column capitals. Christian architects, keenly aware of the expectations and burdens of the classical architectural orders, primarily achieved this Christianization through the use of impost blocks, stylistic changes, and iconographic alterations. In some ways, the Nadler collection's architectural elements are representative examples of an artistic tradition colored by a complicated historical relationship between Christianity and its Greco-Roman heritage. In other ways, the capitals and pilasters in the collection are entirely distinct works of art. The Egyptian local tradition and the wealth of stylistic and iconographic options bring about such variation in capital decoration that many of the Nadler works have few visually similar relatives surviving. It is perhaps more appropriate to view the works of the collection as wholly unique, whose individual features can be traced through the rich Mediterranean artistic tradition, but whose entirety is a Hegelian mark of a specific place and time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for your paper examining the Nadler capitals and their stylistic and Christian adaptations. Our second paper of this session is by Molly A. Stevens, and it is entitled, Go Down to the Netherworld, Plant Grapes, the Nadler Bacchus in Context.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marsengill. Let me get this started. While I'm pulling up all the contingent parts, I want to thank everyone who is attending and Dr. Kirin for making this all possible and everyone behind the scenes right now. So, consider, if you will, a large family gathering, a wedding, funeral, rite of passage, or any number of holidays. Consider the decorations, the tableware, and outfits of those attending. If the guests were vaporized, and only the objects of the event remained, would an archaeologist or art historian be able to securely identify the religious affiliation of the hosts? A shift toward non-religiosity in the contemporary world would make this even more difficult to pin down. A non-religious household might still put up a creche for Christmas, light candles for Hanukkah, or lamps for Diwali. A plurality of identities among those at the gathering would add further dimensions. The symbols of traditions of a religious practice linger on because of other meanings they carry, some personal, some societal. Late antiquity was, to put it mildly, a time of transition in the religious life of the Mediterranean basin. One can conveniently bookend the time period, in the Eastern Mediterranean at least, between the Edict of Milan's legitimization of Christianity in the Roman Empire and the start of the spread of Islam in the 7th century. Egypt was an increasingly Christian area between the 3rd and 5th century, home to church fathers and the first monasteries. Conversion, however, was not a linear process. By referring to a body of art commonly called Coptic as late antique Egyptian, one acknowledges that Christianity, while growing in influence, was not the only game in town. Jews, Manichaeans, and practitioners of various polytheistic religions also lived along the Nile. Whether through sincere belief or cultural importance, the heroes and deities of the classical antiquity are a common subject in late antique Egyptian art. A previously unpublished sculpture fragment in the Nadler collection, currently on display in the Georgia Museum of Art, is an exemplary work of art from a fluid time. While the portrait head is in the form of Dionysus, it is impossible to securely tell the religious affiliation of the person buried below it. The head itself is a big presence despite its small size. Underneath a wreath of 4 acanthus leaves with 2 branches of grapes hanging by the ears is a soft, youthful face. The modeling of the full cheeks and chin are naturalistic, almost pinchable. In contrast, the eyes, lips, nose, ears, and hair are abstracted. The rounded, nubbly black hair mimics the grapes on the wreath. Perhaps the most striking element of this aspect of this work is that it retains an impressive amount of polychromy. While it is possible that the colors are original, their authenticity would be a worthwhile direction for further investigation. Dr. Abby, I know you're in the audience. Let's go. There are 2 possible identifications for this head. The figure's youth, somewhat effeminate features, and crown of leaves and grapes. And the general context suggests this is either Dionysus or a portrait of the deceased in the guise of Dionysus. Along with the influences of Alexandria, Jerusalem, and an abundance of native Egyptian traditions, it is important to take into consideration the influences of the Roman Empire more generally. Since the grain fields of Egypt fed the empire, it would not be surprising if someone from a background with enough wealth and power to commission monumental funerary architecture would be knowledgeable about the fashions of the empire at large. Starting in the 3rd century, elite Romans showed particular interest in being buried in sarcophagi that showed them in formam deorum, where portraits of the dead are imposed upon the bodies of gods and other mythological figures. There are a number of theories as to why one would want to be shown this way. A portrait in formam deorum could suggest that the deceased had similar virtues or features of the mythological figure. The image here of the god of the Nile River and an earth goddess in the Brooklyn Museum could have represented the progenitors of a large family. It could also suggest the dead has gone through apotheosis, that is, become divine after death. Perhaps the most likely reason one would want to be portrayed as a god or hero was to display access to the cultural clout and a Greek-style education. Gymnasia, definitively Greek cultural institutions that served as a combination school, athletic facility, and genteel social club, had been present in Egypt for several hundred years. After 212 CE, when all free individuals in the Roman Empire became citizens, having a classical education was an increasingly important status symbol. It is entirely possible that a Christian, Jew, or adherent of any number of religious leanings present in Egypt at the time would choose to be commemorated with the image of a Greek god, identifying themselves with their class, education, or civic role, rather than an image connected to private devotion. The fluidity between Christian and pagan subjects, and a particular interest in Dionysus, was also found in the literary sphere. Nonnus of Panopolis, a town in central Egypt, who lived between the 4th and 5th century, was a poet whose work included reflections on both dominant religious traditions. Nonnus is primarily known as the author of the longest surviving work of classical epic, the Dionysiaca, a 48-book-long behemoth That's twice as many books as the Iliad, in hexameter and Homeric dialect. The Dionysica, in a Baroque style, recounts the birth and rebirth of Dionysus, his conquering of India, and the spread of his worship. Nonnus is also alleged to be the author of a paraphrase of John, an abridged rendition of the Gospel of John in hexameter. Nonnus was not the only poet in 5th century Egypt that encountered both Christian and pagan ideas in his life and work. He wasn't even the only one from Panopolis. Cyrus of Panopolis was a poet, bishop, and decorated politician, serving as a consul under Theodosius II. He was accused of pagan sympathies and exiled to Cotiaum in Phrygia. Another place where Christian and pagan notions were closer than they were far apart was in a sense of what paradise was like. Tertullian, the church father, even remarks this similarity in his Apology. If we name paradise a place of divine beauty, reserved for the reception of the spirits of the holy, kept from knowledge of this common world by a fiery zone, as it were by a wall, the Lycian fields are before us in capturing belief. Now whence, I ask you, do the philosophers and poets find things so similar? End quote. Well, most classical paganism takes a rather bleak view of the afterlife, where the souls of the dead were either voiceless shades if they were lucky, eternally tortured if they were wicked. There were numerous belief systems that offered a more pleasant afterlife. Of the various cults that promised a more pleasant afterlife in the classical world, among the most popular and archaeologically represented were ones associated with Dionysus. The mythological connections between Dionysus and the hope for resurrection, rejuvenation, or otherwise better afterlife are strong. Some of the strongest evidence that connects Dionysus both with a better afterlife, personal salvation, as well as pastoral garden-like imagery have been found on the bodies of his devotees. Golden tablets etched with metrical or prose inscriptions, included in burials as early as the 5th century BCE, are found widely dispersed around the Mediterranean. These contain images of springs, cypress trees, and holy meadows and groves of Persephone. These tablets often contain a sort of guide for traversing the netherworld. Potentially, this idea that the underworld was dangerous but navigable with proper guidance and geography would have appealed to those familiar with Egyptian religious practices. Myths about Zagreus, dismembered and born into another body, and Dionysus, escaping death through the intercession of Zeus, would appeal to those wanting personal salvation. The dismemberment and rebirth of Zagreus might also have held special appeal in Egypt, since the story is similar to the dismemberment and resurrection of Osiris. The idea of a pleasant life after death in a garden-like atmosphere developed further during the Roman Empire. Life in the countryside was strongly associated with otium, a practice of relaxation and wholesome pastimes combined with an implied level of self-sufficiency. This was an important part of the Latin concept of a good life. Wealthy Romans sought it in their countryside villas, in carefully manicured gardens, farmed fields, and curated wild places. All of these were examples of loci amoeni, idealized, peaceful landscapes that widely feature in Roman poetry. Statius, a 1st century poet, uses language that recalls a pleasant afterlife in his description of his homeland around the Bay of Naples. Peace is easy, this translation is my own. Peace is easy in that place, and you fall into a life of leisure, and never ever is rest disturbed, and sleep pierces everything. This wish for pax, securitas, quires, that is peace, security, quiet, is extended to the dead in imperial literature. Epitaphs and inscriptions wishing the dead somno aeternale, forever sleep, a blessing seemingly unique to Rome, came into fashion in the mid-2nd century and never really went away. Later in the Silvae, Statius consoles his friend grieving over the death of an enslaved member of the household, saying he sinks to join the pious and plucks the peace of Elysium. For Egyptian Christians in late antiquity, the afterlife is also a bucolic landscape. In the Apocalypse of Paul, souls of the dead visit a fortified paradise modeled on a monastery. Much like the portrait head, the text originated in Egypt around the 4th century and is well traveled, with versions in more than a dozen languages, and the account of a guided trip through heaven and hell has left fingerprints all across the Western canon. While the innermost area of paradise, the city of Christ, is only accessible to the chaste and the monastic, the land of paradise which surrounds it is accessible to the more generally righteous. The land of promise is marked by an explosion of agricultural abundance, and special attention is given to grapes. Along with flourishing fruit trees and date palms, the land of promise boasts vineyards where, and I quote, every vine had 10,000 branches, and each branch had upon it 10,000 bunches of grapes, and every bunch had on it 10,000 grapes, end quote. Another depiction of heaven as a garden in 4th century context is found in the hymns of St. Ephrem the Syrian, where God is portrayed as a gracious host. Guests are directed to come to his banquet eagerly, for he awaits their arrival, for he is a lover of mankind, end quote. The idea of an afterlife for the blessed being a banquet complete with wine is present in the New Testament. Vines, vineyards, and winemaking references are thickly distributed in the Gospels. Winemakers take seriously that, according to the Gospel of John, the first miracle Jesus performed was making wine. 3 of the Gospels have some variation of the verse, but I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom, end quote. Many late antique Christians clearly imagined the banquet in heaven would be something like a boozy garden party. A man dressed for a banquet and surrounded by grapes would not be out of place in that notion of paradise. While the portrait head could have been from several architectural features, it is a safe assumption that the portrait head came from a funerary context, such as these. Not only do the majority of pieces of sculpture in both public and private collections from late antique Egypt come from funerary context, the portrait head bears a strong resemblance to other funerary niche sculptures in the Nadler collection. The bust with a female figure and acanthus leaves is strong similarities to the Bacchus head, especially the thick neck, full cheeks, and geometrical facial features. The female portrait in the niche is a classic example of the style that developed around Hierapolis Magna, also known as Anas or Nas al-Madina, an important ancient city in the Fayum region and the capital of the 20th nome. The sculptural look of the region is distinctive. Here I have interposed an image of the Bacchus head I'm featuring and the other niche sculpture in the Nadler collection in order to give a sense of how these proportions kind of match up. The sculptural look of the region is distinctive, characterized by oval-shaped or rounded heads that are filled with geometricized features. Eyes that are pointed ovals, small noses made of triangularly pointed projections that fit above the straight, grooved curves of their small mouths, end quote. The stylistic similarities lead me to believe the Bacchus portrait was also from Hierapolis Magna. Hierapolis Magna is notable for its abundance of niched graves. While niche graves from this area and from late antique Egypt in general display a wide array of designs both relating to classical paganism and Christianity, there is no especially strong stylistic difference between the images from either religious group. The angels or nymphs have similarly soft faces, and the abstracted geometric or vegetal motifs that twist around them could be from either. While most of the funerary architecture from Hierapolis Magna has been removed from its context, it is likely there was little differentiation in where pagans and Christians were buried, as in the sculptural styles. In Harwara, Bagwat, and Kargra, clearly Christian and clearly pagan tombs are found side by side. Christians and pagans were buried beneath similar art and architecture, and their corpses were also treated in similar ways. Late antique Egyptians, while no longer making bandaged mummies, were interested in preserving the body from decay. A series of 4th century burials from the Kagara oasis, both of pagan and Christian styles, display these differences. While not a universal practice, the bodies of pagans were buried in a manner similar to the traditional mummy. This included frequent evisceration, bathing in natron, and the application of fragrant oil or spices before being dressed, shrouded, and interred. Christians were neither eviscerated nor treated with natron, but large amounts of salt were applied to the body, sometimes also deposited in grave clothes or in the grave. They were also dressed, frequently in elegant clothes, and shrouded. While an east-west orientation is a common record of a Christian burial, there is no consistent pattern in orientation for late antique Egyptian burials. Both traditions also had a particular interest in the graves remaining intact. A mid-5th century Byzantine regulation makes, in boilerplate language, clear how important this was. I'll read the quote. Although the divine spirit does not undergo the necessity of death, still the souls love the abode of bodies they have left, and for some kind of mysterious reason, they rejoice in the honor of their tomb. It is excessively barbarous and insane cruelty to begrudge this last service to those who are deprived of the light of life, and to destroy their tombs is inexplicable crime. Inexpiable crime, yeah, sorry. The belief the soul needs a body would have appealed to those familiar with the Egyptian tradition, where the Ba could leave the body and come back. A growing interest in the Christian world, in the collection of relics, might have also helped inspire this kind of law. In the interment of the body itself, both Christians and pagans had similar practices and motivations. A good example of the apotheosis of the dead is found in the 1st or 2nd century tomb from Hermopolis. While it predates the making of the Dionysus head by at least 2 centuries, the architecture of the tomb space is remarkably similar to a common motif in Heraclius Magna and a number of other late antique Egyptian sites. The focal point is a curved niche topped with a half-scallop shell. A distinctive feature of this tomb is an inscription on either side of the doorway that leads into the inner chamber where the niche sits. It gives the name of the deceased, Isidora, gives the circumstances of her death, drowning, and the name of the male relative who commissioned the tomb, Oriades, and tells of the family she left behind, imagined her afterlife, and the offerings they brought in her memory. The first inscription reads in part, "I salute you, my child. Nymph is your name, and each year the seasons pour out their libations for you." Specifically, the heat of summer brings the drink that comes from Bacchus's presses, and for you, a crown of grapes, having tied together the bunches carried on branches. The associations between young women and nymphs appear to have continued to be a popular motif for the graves of young women. The Brooklyn Museum has a niche decoration of a woman in a long dress riding a dog-faced sea monster, seen here. The Coptic Museum has a number of niche nymphs from Heracleopolis, one emerging nude from foliage, another fleeing an amorous satyr. The niche with a bust of a woman in acanthus leaves in the Nadler collection could also represent the deceased as a nymph. Isidora's epitaph and the continued popularity of representing the deceased as nymphs does 2 things to solidify the Dionysus portrait as one meant to represent a dead dearly beloved. It shows that a crown of grapes is appropriate attire for the afterlife. Nymphs are also frequently part of the retinue of Dionysus, and parades of revelers along with the god are a common feature of sarcophagi across the Roman world. If the dead man did not become like to a god, he, like so many nymphs, could join the party. Images of Dionysus himself are also common among surviving funerary niches from Heracleopolis Magna between the 4th and 6th century. There are at least 6 sculptures with images of Dionysus that are likely from that town in the Coptic Museum in Cairo alone, and another shown here from Dumbarton Oaks. He is shown both clothed and nude, reclining and striding forward, accompanied by nymphs, satyrs, and Heracles. The niche sculpture in the Dumbarton Oaks shows an image of Dionysus as a returning hero. The dead of Heracleopolis Magna were buried with images of Dionysus both on and above their bodies. Dionysiac motifs such as dancing maenads, grapes, and general revelry are a common motif in late antique Egyptian grave clothes. In conclusion, let us return to the Nadler head. An interest in portraying the cultural affiliations of the dead and an interfaith desire for them to find a garden party in the afterlife is clearly present in this image, regardless of where they directed their prayers. In future exhibitions, I would hope that the Nadler Bacchus head be shown as a portrait of a person from a time when things were more fluid than had been previously assumed. I hope that he becomes a subject of curiosity and inspiration to visitors navigating their own fluid time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Molly, for this wonderful paper. I'd like to invite the speakers to come back at this time so we can ask some questions. While we wait for some questions to come in, I, of course, can pose a couple. To Alex, you discussed the symbolism of columns to Christians, how the tops of the columns are seen as this place at the threshold of heaven, you know, columns themselves being that kind of link from the earthly to the heaven, but then particularly the columns at the top at the capital level as kind of this meeting place between, you know, heaven and earth. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the pagan beliefs regarding that kind of symbolism, if the columns themselves held that kind of symbolism, and did they have similar metaphors regarding deities or heroes being columns or pillars like they assigned to the apostles and the saints?
Yeah, so there's clearly some pagan antecedents to this idea of sort of the higher you are, the more holy, I guess, you are, is not something that just comes out of nowhere for Christians. And you see it, and actually this is common even not just like in Greece and Rome, but this is a very common feature of all ancient religions, really, the sort of the sky being more heavenly. And so when you build architectural spaces, the interiors of those that are higher tend to have that sort of connection to higher levels. And so even if you think of the Parthenon with the Greeks, you know, they tend to reserve their depictions of their gods or their heroes for those upper spaces, and the architrave and the entablature for like the frieze, you'll have the wars with the Amazons and the centaurs and the Trojan War and things like that. Those tend to be reserved for those upper levels that sit on top of the columns. And so I had other pieces to this that I had to cut out for time, but you do have these earlier things, even the Colosseum that we all can picture in our minds. The orders of the classical architectural orders, as in like the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, are structured in an order on there, where the Dorics are on the first level, and then the Ionic and the Corinthian. There's already this idea that the higher levels are reserved in some way for particular pieces. And when you get to the Christian church, you see this vertically, as I kind of described, but also horizontally, where the places closest to the apse, the holiest places of a church, you will tend to find more Corinthian or composite order column capitals. And then as you get further away towards the western entrance where people are coming in, you will be more likely to find Ionic columns, and then maybe the outsides could have Doric or something. So there's great attention paid to a hierarchy, both horizontally and vertically. And the exact level of the capital being kind of in the heavenly realm is very tricky to define. And I had to cut out a lot of this for time purposes of where I kind of pulled this argument from. But I think that the stylites really give a good view of that, where because with Saint Simeon, he would have sort of a weird situation. He'd be on top of his column. People would climb a ladder nearby, to be able to get closer to him, to speak with him and get advice from him. And those, at some height on the column are not really thought of as being in the heavenly realm. They still need to get to the top of the column to talk to Simeon, who's already there, to get, him to talk, or to get his heavenly kind of advice. So there's definitely that distinction there. And the column of Trajan as well kind of gives you that, where you're to get to the top of the column of Trajan, you're in an internal spiral staircase that's sort of disorienting and dark, and it's not until you reach the top of it where you can come out on the light, see the forum of Trajan, and then you get that sort of the experience, of being on top of the world, and you get that sort of heavenly view. And that's with you being kind of at that level. So I think there's lots of other pieces, and monasteries and cypress trees. There's a lot of other kind of things that go with this, but that sort of, the higher you are, the closer you are to God is pretty standard overall.
I'm sorry to push this, but is there, because there are these mediators in Christianity who span these realms. In pagan belief systems, and of course there's not one pagan belief system, but among them, is there mediators? Are there bridges that are like considered entities, divinities or heroes or something that are considered like these bridges, like columns?
I can't say I came across any particularly in my research. I don't see sort of the equation of like the apostle to a column the same way like a hero to a column. Maybe that does exist. It's not something that I've come across. And like my example of the Parthenon, the heroes of the Trojan War are depicted in the entablature alongside gods and other mythological figures. So I'm not sure. There's something too there that there is a distinction between the ground level and the pieces held above the column, and the column itself, by the fact that it is taken into a form of being a triumphal, monument on its own, says something about its importance, and that it does hold up that heavenly realm in some sort of way. But I didn't personally come across any actual figural representations of it.
Right. And Molly, what's fascinating to me, as I work mostly in this time period, of course, and I work a lot with portraiture, as you know, but scholars, we used to have this kind of strict division between what was pagan and what was Christian, and now we're recognizing more and more about this period of late antiquity, that it was a very ambiguous time. And for those who would have called themselves Christians, we're finding out they still participated in a lot of these rituals, civic rituals, private rituals, and belief systems that we would call pagan. And this is reflected profoundly in their art, once we open up our eyes to see that kind of thing. So my question is, how did you find anything about how Christians justify being associated with pagan deities? Was it possible, maybe in the criticism by church, like preachers and bishops and so on, to be a good Christian and still engage in these activities? Were they censured? And at the same time, since we're recognizing Christians participating in these kind of more pagan things, does it work the other way? Can we see pagans doing, adopting Christianity as one part of their identity, maybe doing some, engaging in some, or bringing Christ or saints into their kind of pantheon?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for bringing that up. While I did not find any sort of especially church fathers discussion of what happens when you include pagan symbolism and when you use that, I have a sneaking suspicion, or at least that supports it. I think that we are biased in the fact that history would preserve the zealous, that if someone later on is very much anti-pagan, I think there's much more likely for them to either both write it down and for it to stay. I need to continue to do more research on this. This is something I can add to further projects, but it's a really good point. I can say that in the way you might be able to borrow from both in your practice, that at least anthropologically seems to hold up pretty well. The idea of a cult of saints at all could be potentially seen as a way for pagan beliefs and Christian beliefs to get along. One of my favorite examples of this, while not explicitly late antique and not explicitly Egyptian, but definitely about Christianity and classical paganism getting comfy with each other, is that the local variation of the Madonna around ancient Poseidonia or Paestum is shown holding a pomegranate. And the temple of Hera at Poseidonia / Paestum, the cult images of Hera there also held a pomegranate. So that's not necessarily Egyptian, but another way that classical pagan imagery can be sort of smoothly adapted, adopted, borrowed, etc.
I'm thinking also of the terracotta figures from the Nadler collection, which again, we don't know the context. Did you want to speak about that, Molly?
Oh, they're just adorable. I'm just excited to buy them.
But they seem to have been, I mean, part of a group of, this is a wider phenomenon than, of course, wherever these particular ones were found. But at St. Minas, I believe it was, they have found these votive offerings, these terracotta votive offerings that are directly coming from pagan cult activities, but now offered in this new monastic complex that's dedicated to a cult of a saint in Egypt, which is of course fascinating. There is a question here. Hi Molly, great job. I was intrigued by your image from T. Thomas of the reconstructed funerary context. For my clarification, did you put the Bacchic Dionysian head there with the proposed reconstruction, or did Thomas to create the composite image? Either way, it was a very provocative way to understand the original display context of the work.
The composite image, the one that's in color, is my own. But I've used Thelma Thomas's sketch as inspiration for how the general layout of stuff is. The composite image, I can try to share it if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Let's see if I can do this. Share. All right. So if you can see the PowerPoint, the image there, which I used as a basis for what these niches might have looked like, is Thelma Thomas's work. To make the composite image, I took the arch piece from the Nadler collection of the woman emerging from acanthus leaves and just superimposed our little Bacchus head on top of it to get a sense of what, in a little bit more less of a sketchy sense, what the display context might have looked like. I hope that helps.
Definitely. It was very compelling to be able to see that put together, these niche heads and the arches and how they would have worked in context, especially to have that kind of head jutting out from these. Yeah. And I was wondering if you had anything, what you make of the eyes, if you have any observations about them, because it is kind of fleshy and naturalistic to a point. And of course, as you pointed out, the eyes are what's really, really abstracted in this case. And I wonder if you had any insight into that.
I'm not so much sure about insight, but I do know that especially eyes and the sort of heavy rimming of them is a big part of cultural depictions in Egypt, from pharaonic to mummy portraits and encaustic and on and on and on. I think that in the terms of a dark tomb niche environment, they might have had an especially dramatic catch. So, it makes them a point of focus because they don't look quite right. It could also just be a style thing. It does help with the heavy rimming of the eyes in the Dionysus we have, that assuming, perhaps fraughtly, that the color is original, is a very good way to put on that eyeliner.
I was thinking as a representation of Dionysus, projecting this kind of spiritual eye into this space that is, again, one of those meeting places between the living and the dead is very, very effective. But then as a possible representation of the deceased, who would also be that point of contact between the two realms, I think the eyes are really effective. And I also really enjoyed about your presentation, kind of linking all the grapes and the grapevines, and not just to the Eucharist, but have the, how Christians, beyond the Eucharist could have seen wine and grapevines and so on, and the general banqueting and feasting. Here's a question for Alex. What textual evidence do we have that early Christians considered pagan artistic or architectural motifs as impure or immoral?
So I do think that is something that we need to treat carefully. And I know Helen Sarati, she talks about this some, about how like the couple images that I picked where you have like a Venus or an emperor or something with a cross on their head, that we need to view that, like those in particular, the ones that aren't destroyed, as being neutralized, not being neutralized in a way where they were bad or something and now we've created them good. But for her, that is more of that bridging of the connection of this heritage and that sort of, that early Christians are viewing their whole Greco-Roman heritage as leading up to, you know, the coming of Christianity. And so it is something that you can accept in that way. But textually, I didn't come across anything that was explicit. It was tended to be through example. So I can think of, there's one piece in the life of Saint Porphyry that was kind of striking to me, where he tears down a Greek temple and makes very specific choices. He takes the marble slabs and the walls of the most sacred interiors and specifically puts them out on the front walkway for the purpose of having having Christians coming to this new church to step on them, as well as having animals outside step on them. Like there was a very deliberate choice made to kind of reduce the impact or the prior impact of this temple. And so I saw it more through that, sort of like stories that were told and you kind of imply that there's something wrong here, besides just the general, the marking of things with crosses and things like that.
And here's a question from Molly. Great job. Does the bust of Dionysus have anything to do with classical Athenian tragedy masks? Euripides comes to mind, and I wondered if the late antique depiction of Dionysus is Euripidean because the Gospels read like Greek tragedies, and that's another cultural merging.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that when it comes to the merging of Dionysic and Christian beliefs, it would be a good, especially in the Euripidean sense, that would be a very good illustration for a sort of broader swath of classicism. So I feel like if you're doing that as a study, then late antiquity can be more of an end point than a middle. But I really, really, really like the idea of this being something like a theater mask. That really feeds into this discussion we had previously about what the heck those big old staring eyes are doing. So perhaps it is. I think if I was going to continue to investigate this, I would like to see especially how masks factor into interior decoration, because I know they're very much a part of Imperial Roman house decoration. I don't know how that worked in Egypt. I don't know what theater traditions in Egypt were like, but the idea of this face being like a mask and something that perhaps a deity or perhaps the deceased can look through is super cool. I'm going to keep looking on that. I have made a note. Thank you.
Very nice. So I think we are through the questions. Hello, welcome back to our third and final session today. In this session, there are 2 more papers, but these papers will be looking at modern interpretations and perceptions of Coptic art. And I use this term deliberately because this is the kind of art historical name that was assigned to it and from where these interpretations come. The first paper has to do with an artist, and the second has to do with the interpretation of Coptic art by art historians in the 20th century. And once again, we will allow time for both speakers before the Q&A session, and please type the questions you may have at the very bottom where you see the Q&A box. So our first paper is by Lacy Hamilton. It's entitled Marsden Hartley and Coptic Textiles, Late Antique Art from Egypt and Modernism in America. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Marsengill, and also to Dr. Kirin and everyone at the Georgia Museum of Art who helped organize this. Also to everyone in the audience, including my major advisor, Dr. Simon, who actually introduced me to the artist that I'll be discussing in my talk today, Marsden Hartley. So thank you so much. My talk will be entitled Marsden Hartley and Coptic Textiles, Late Antique Art from Egypt and Modernism in America. So let's begin. In 1966, the Nadler collection was given its first large American exhibition in New York City at the Gallery of Modern Art, showing 116 objects. The exhibition was entitled 6 Centuries of Coptic Art and opened alongside Evening in Egypt, a benefit organized to support the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization and the American Committee to Preserve Abu Simbel, an ancient site of temples built by King Ramses II. The exhibition played a prominent role in the campaign to financially support the efforts to save the ancient Egyptian temples, which were planned to be submerged by the Aswan High Dam. While the $1 million campaign would prove successful, moving and reconstructing the temples on higher land, this is not the full extent of the exhibition's use for the promotion of external interest. The imagery and style of the Nadler collection also acted as a historical precedent for the contemporary art historical interest in figurative expressionism. The Gallery of Modern Art issued a press release in June of 1966 during the run of the exhibition, stating, quote, "Coptic art has recently had a great vogue in Europe. Critics have noticed a feeling of expressionism," end quote. The European interest in Coptic art is related to the diverse reaction to abstract expressionism that's often left out of the official narrative of art history. There was not an immediate total embrace of abstract expressionism, despite the style's promotion by leading art critics such as Clement Greenberg. For example, George Huntington Hartford II, the founder of the Gallery of Modern Art, philanthropist, heir to the great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company fortune, and friend of the owner of the Nadler collection, Dr. Emanuel Nadler, favored figural modern art over the increasingly popular abstract expressionism style. Hartford founded the Gallery of Modern Art in 1964 as an alternative to the Museum of Modern Art, which included abstract representations in their definition of modernism. Hartford's permanent collection was housed on the 4th and 5th floors of the gallery and included no abstract art. John Canaday, a leading American art critic and art historian in the 1960s, published a review in the New York Times a week after the opening of the Nadler show, making explicit the connection between the Coptic exhibition and the rejection of abstract expressionism. Canaday, who was proponent against the abstract expressionism, included in his review, quote, "I will not go into my spiel here, except to say that the exhibition may be a discovery for some sensitive members of the public who are aware that something worth looking at was created before Leo Castelli went into business. If you demand contemporary okay, then remember that Matisse was strongly influenced by Coptic art," end quote. Leo Castelli, an Italian-American art dealer whose first American curatorial effort was the 9th Street Show of 1951, which marked the formal debut of abstract expressionism, opened the Leo Castelli Gallery in New York City in 1957. Castelli's gallery was one of the most prominent commercial venues for modern art at the time of the 1966 exhibition. As for Matisse's place in this modernist narrative, we'll return to that subject later. The Nadler collection, for Hartford and for other critics of abstract expressionism, provided a historic validation for their current aesthetic concerns, exemplifying the expressive power of figural art rendered in a non-illusionistic and non-academic style. To further assert the connection between the Coptic objects and figural expressionistic modern art, 6 Centuries of Coptic Art was mounted alongside a retrospective exhibition of Salvador Dali's artwork. Dr. Emanuel Nadler recalls that Dali was especially interested in a small Coptic relief of an Orient figure that was exhibited at the 1966 show. According to Dr. Nadler, Dali believed the relief would make a perfect work of modern art. The relief fragment, on view in the Georgia Museum's Modernism Foretold exhibition, is now understood to likely include modern recarving, following some of the original figure's outlines. Some of the aspects of the relief that raise alarms to its complete authenticity are the proportions of the head and thick neck, the lack of bend in the Orient figure's arms, hands like baseball mitts, and rudimentary delineation of folds and pleating in the figure's costume, all of which do not conform to the usual iconography of the period. The same characteristics that mark the work as possibly recarved appealed to Dali's modern aesthetic interest. The American audience was prepared to appreciate the modernist spirit of Coptic art as it appeared to be the visual precursor to modernism. To learn how to examine the Nadler collection through this modernist lens, and to further understand the influence of Coptic art on 19th to 20th century Western art, I'd like to turn our attention to studying the relationship between American modernist and expressionist painter Marston Hartley and his collection of Coptic textile fragments. Hartley, who died in 1943 when Dr. Emanuel Nadler was still living in Egypt, did not attend the 1966 exhibition at the Gallery of Modern Art. However, looking into the impact of Coptic art on an American avant-garde artist will inform our understanding of the effect of the collection on the American modern art scene. The influence of Coptic textiles on Hartley's return to expressive figural representations in the last decades before his death in 1943 foretells the modernist reception of the 1966 Nadler show and allows us to closely examine the visual allure of Coptic art to American modernists. Although Coptic textile work was not the exclusive medium within the Nadler collection influential to American modernists at this time, an extraordinary number of Coptic textiles survive today due to the ancient custom of burying the dead with their fabrics. The arid climate of Egypt allows for the preservation of centuries-old Coptic textiles, and the color and texture of the works set an ancient precedent for the artwork of the American modernists who studied them. In addition, our discussion will allow for the explanation of why textiles were particularly acquired by modern artists, largely dating back to the work of French archaeologist Albert Gaillet. Marston Hartley was an American modernist painter born in Maine who studied in Paris and Berlin and New York City, and in the early 20th century around the outbreak of World War I, but took to German Expressionism more than French modernism. Hartley's early artwork often combined abstraction and German Expressionism. Hartley returns to the United States permanently in 1930, painting American life throughout the country until eventually returning to Maine in 1937, where he would predominantly paint coastal scenes and fulfill his role as, quote, the painter of Maine, until his death in 1943. Hartley's American paintings in the last years of his life are much more figural, while maintaining a lack of illusionism in their rendering. This artistic shift coincides with the beginning of Hartley's collaboration and friendship with a noted collector and dealer of Middle Eastern art, Dikran Kelikyan. Kelikyan was a Turkish citizen of Persian Armenian descent and had connections with the highest circles of the Ottoman Empire. Hartley's relationship with Kelikyan formed from a mutual connection, Milton Avery. Avery was a fellow American modernist painter living in New York with his wife Sally in the 1930s. Hartley and Avery were longtime friends, and Hartley and Kelikyan frequently visited the Avery's apartment in New York. This relationship was the subject of a recent exhibition entitled Coptic Art, Dikran Kelikyan and Milton Avery at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2004. Kelikyan encouraged contemporary artists to become interested in ancient art by cultivating relationships with multiple modernists of the time, including Mary Cassatt, Pablo Picasso, John Singer Sargent, and Henri Matisse, as well as Hartley and Avery. Kelikyan was also a noted collector of avant-garde art, stating in 1939, quote, "I started to collect modern art after seeing that its origins were in my antiquities," end quote. Kelikyan began acquiring Coptic works in the late 19th century. Notably, Kelikyan likely acquired several works through Albert Gaillet, a prominent French archaeologist of the time. It's likely that Kelikyan and Gaillet knew each other from their separate participation in the Paris Exposition Universelle of 1900. While Kelikyan was a member of the jury at the World's Fair, Gaillet exhibited Coptic fabrics at the Palais du Costume. The Coptic textiles were the results of Gaillet's excavations at the necropolises of Antinoe, the ancient Roman Antinopolis, from 1895 to 1899. Gaillet's exhibit at the Exposition Universelle helped spark a craze of, quote, Coptomania in Europe in the early 20th century. Notably, Henri Matisse, who was a relatively unknown French painter by 1900, and was hired at the exposition to paint the halls of the Grand Palais, likely discovered Gaillet's display of Coptic textiles. Georges Dutouilly, Matisse's son-in-law and scholar of Coptic art, asserts that Gaillet's display likely marks the beginning of Matisse's interest in Coptic textiles, claiming that the display, quote, attracted a great deal of attention, end quote. Similarly, Ninette Rodney, the granddaughter of Kelekien, prominent art donor and American Art Association administrator, asserts the influence of Coptic textiles on the work of founding Fauvist, Matisse, and André Derain, stating in 1955, quote, the strong black outlines and brilliant flat colors used by Matisse and Derain are obviously related to the pictorial techniques of the ancient Coptic weavers. There is no doubt that these men were fascinated by and loved, and some collected, Coptic textiles, end quote. Although the whereabouts of Matisse's collection is currently unknown, the collection was known to include textile fragments from Kelekien, and the artist did own one of Gaillet's books entitled, and I'll give you the English translation from the original, The Universal Exposition of 1900, House of Costume in Egypt from the 3rd to 13th century after Albert Gaillet's excavations. Auguste Rodin, another exhibitor at the 1900 exposition, also began a collection of Coptic textiles in the 20th century, which are now housed at the Rodin Museum in Paris. Hartley could only just last years of his life, at which time he acquired 23 Coptic textile fragments through his friend Kelekien. Almost all of the fragments were likely from Kelekien's Coptic textile album of 1910, which I show you here. Hartley's textile collection was gifted to the Bates College Museum of Art in Hartley's birthplace of Lewiston, Maine, by the Hartley estate in 1951 after Hartley's death in 1943. The museum's scholars believe, based on the iconography of the collection, that many of the Coptic textiles were acquired by Kelekien from Gaillet's collection of Antinoe excavation discoveries, directly connecting Hartley's interest in Coptic artwork to the European Coptomania of the early 20th century. Hartley's Coptic textile collection, which I show you here, consists of fragmented textiles, which were originally reassembled with adhesive sewn to paper boards and arranged into plates that formed Kelekien's 1910 textile album. Marie-Helene Rutschowskaya, director or curator of the Department of Egyptian Antiquities and director of the Coptic section at the Louvre, quotes Hartley in her 1990 publication, Coptic Fabrics. Hartley says, quote, I must not forget to speak of the Coptic embroideries, which for me are classics of great painting. I think I was never more completely bowled over than when I saw the amazing collection of these embroideries, which were recently shown by my friend, Mr. Dikran Kelekien, who after possessing them for nearly 40 years decided to show them off at last. And when I want to know about great tonality, I get them out like a pack of cards and play solitaire, end quote. Beginning with tonality, which Hartley specifically references, we can begin to read the Coptic artwork within both his collection and the Nadler collection through the eyes of a modernist artist. Early 20th century American artists, especially those working within Alfred Stieglitz's circle in New York City, were introduced to the Fauvist art of Matisse, Picasso, and Cezanne through Stieglitz's Little Galleries of the Photo Secession, which would later become the 291 Art Gallery, named after its address at 291 Fifth Avenue. European modernist focus on the formal quality of color as a primary language for the artist's expression resulted in the use of vibrant color palettes within their work, countering academic realism. Many American modernists, including Arthur Dove, John Marin, Abraham Walkowitz, Max Weber, and Hartley, were influenced by Fauvism, incorporating bold color into their composition. Some artists moved towards abstraction through the expressive style of Fauvism, using simple geometric shapes and bright colors to convey the artist's inner expression. However, Coptic textiles demonstrated a historic precedent for the use of emotive color within figural representations, countering the movement towards abstract expressionism in the mid-20th century. The use of black outlines to legibility of and to provide contrast to the bright, flat colors of Coptic textiles can be seen in Matisse's 1906 to 1907 oil on canvas portrait painting of his daughter Marguerite, and in Hartley's Roses from Hispania oil painting on Academy board from 1936. The black outline allowed the use of emotive color without losing too much legibility in the work, using a non-illusionistic language to depict figural forms. In addition to color, one of the defining characteristics of Coptic art in any medium, but notably in textiles for the discussion of Hartley, is the weighty and distorted forms of both human and non-human figures. The figures are often simplified and flattened, moving away from a naturalistic rendering of the human form. In Jean Paris's review of the Centuries of Coptic Art exhibition in June of 1966, she discusses the modernist reception of the Coptic figural representations, stating, quote, "Coptic art draws away from the naturalistic representation proper to Greek and Hellenistic art. It be called in modern terms an expressionistic style. Colors are boldly opposed and forms, human or other, are distorted, sometimes violently, with tension and disquiet, and to express some question," end quote. Making forms appear more weighty, swollen, or block-like characterizes Hartley's late paintings after his acquisition of Coptic textile fragments. The scoop-like hands and engorged neck of the Orant figure in the Nadler collection of Dali's interest are reflected in Hartley's male figures. Paris continues, quote, "This is no doubt the reason why Coptic art often appears so modern to us, whose deep anxiety is reflected in our own art," end quote. The modernist implication of the visual distortion of figures, moving away from the naturalistic depictions, is the non-illusionistic representations suggest more expression rather than the Hartley's study of Coptic art allowed him to confidently return to figuration after years of making abstract portraiture, his transition to depicting human figures emotively through a Coptic idiom. In addition, Hartley's paintings in Coptic textiles often share figural motifs, such as flowers, fish, and birds. These motifs are often depicted as not fully grounded in space and can be a part of ornamental patterning. Through Hartley's inclusion of these subjects, which are often decorative representations of paradise, rebirth, or bounty in Coptic textiles, Hartley renders everyday coastal American form paradise of Maine. Hartley's interest in and acquisition of Coptic textile fragments can thus be understood as a microcosm or foretelling of the general American modernist reception of the 6 Centuries of Coptic Art exhibition in 1966. The Nadler collection acts as a marker of the specific time in the history of American Expressionism. Exhibition of Coptic art, especially Coptic textiles, played a seminal role in the mid-20th century rejection of Expressionism, demonstrating the expressive power of non-illusionistic yet figural forms. That's all.
Thank you, Lacy, for your paper. Very interesting. Our second paper, I'll just move on, is by Charlotte Gaillet. I don't know if she pronounced it French or Gaillet, but I will go with Gaillet because it's nice, French. And the title is Writing Authentic Histories, Recognizing the Role of Coptic Art Forgeries Within Museum Collections. Thank you, Charlotte.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Marsengill. Like my colleagues, I would also like to thank the Georgia Museum of Art and for this event today, and Dr. Kirin for his support and advice for this research project. My paper, Writing Authentic Histories, Recognizing the Role of Coptic Forgeries Within Museum Collections, focuses on the contemporary reception of Coptic art through museum practices. So, with the rise of interest in Coptic art among collectors and museums during the 1950s and 60s, the market saw an introduction of works claiming to be from late antiquity Egypt. Throughout the late 20th century, grave stelae, niches, tympana, capitals, and friezes entered American and European art collections with little known about their provenance. However, many of these newly discovered Coptic works were thought to come from the village of Sheikhabada, the Arabic name for ancient Antinopolis. In 1977, curator and scholar Gary Vacan questioned the authenticity of the Sheikhabada Coptic works in an unpublished paper delivered at the 3rd Annual Byzantine Studies Conference at Columbia University in New York City. In his detailed analysis of Sheikhabada art, Vacan divided the group into 4 subcategories: grave stelae, 3-dimensional heads and high relief busts, architectural decoration, and relief friezes. And he examined each group's authenticity through a survey of their style, motifs, and weathering. Vacan determined that the Coptic sculpture originated from genuine late antique limestone, but the majority of the works were recut and restored to improve their commercial value within the art market. In 1981, Vacan collaborated with Susan Boyd in the curation of the exhibition Questions of Authenticity Among the Arts of Byzantium at the Dumbarton Oaks Museum, illustrating the problems of confirming suspect works of art. The introduction for the exhibition catalog succinctly summarizes Vacan and Boyd's curatorial concerns for displaying works of art that are not fully authenticated, stating, "For whether a modern artifact is intentionally made and sold as Byzantine, or is simply mistakenly perceived as Byzantine, the effect is basically the same. The object, a fake, is traveling under an assumed identity and will by necessity bear false testimony to the life and culture of the past." In 2000, Thelma K. Thomas adopted a similar critical approach to Boyd and Vacan while recontextualizing Coptic funerary sculpture in her book, Late Antique Funerary Sculpture, Images for This World and the Next. The recut limestone of the Sheikhabada group that entered the art market during the mid-1900s were produced in an effort to capitalize from the surge in demand for Coptic art. At the time of collection, these works were believed to be excellent, well-preserved examples of authentic Coptic sculpture. With large sums spent to acquire works from the Sheikhabada group, curators around the world must now consider how to display the modern recut art, but also maintain the legacy of the culture and people from late antique Egypt. Almost 40 years later, Boyd and Vacan's original concerns that unauthentic works will propagate a skewed understanding for a period, culture, or people is confronted by a new threat: the rise of digitized museum collections. Digital catalog entries are often created for a museum's entire collection, including works of art that are not truly authentic. Oftentimes, the digital catalog entries contain only the basic information for a work of art, including artist, date, provenance, dimension, and measurements. For works of Coptic art, this practice means that an entry rarely addresses or identifies if a sculpture falls into the Sheikhabada group or has been recarved during the modern period. As a result, works of questionable authenticity falsely represent the style and motifs of Coptic sculpture. This paper considers the contribution of not fully authentic works within the art historical understanding of Coptic art by examining examples of sculpture in the Nadler collection, past exhibitions with displays or forgeries or fakes, and museum studies examining the rise of online viewership. The Nadler collection includes 3 peculiar sculptures, possibly from funerary sites, that divert from the traditional understanding of Coptic art. These 3 works, female figure holding a wreath, a woman holding a cross, and orant figure, appear to have modern interventions and recarvings, which make us to believe they are not fully authentic works from Coptic Egypt and possibly related to the Sheikhabada group. As previously mentioned, from the last decade of the 19th century, the fashion arose for the collection of Coptic art and spread throughout Europe. Following World War II, there was a vast production of Coptic forgeries that entered the art market. The Nadlers added the last of their collection in 1941 at the start of World War II, and the recarved works within the collection suggest that there was an introduction of unauthentic work prior to the mass production of these forgeries within the Sheikhabada group. I do not attempt to prove that these works are either fully authentic or forgeries, but instead discuss how the style of these sculptures misrepresent the period and how, without careful curation, these works have the potential to muddle the canon of Coptic funerary sculpture. The term Coptic here is used in the broader sense to describe works of art excavated from late antique Egypt, rather than referencing the group of Christians who resided in the region during the period. Christian themes are common, but explicit Christian symbols on Coptic funerary sculpture are rare. Often, the works of art present pagan or secular scenes that can be translated as a moral lesson within the Christian tradition, or that reference Egypt's Hellenic past. Much of the Coptic sculpture that is considered authentic has been found from or related to architectural sites in the form of low reliefs, pilaster capitals, and friezes, like the capital with eagle and crosses from the Nadler collection. Sculptures found in the round or considerably removed from the relief background may indicate the work has experienced a modern recarving or is an outright forgery. Numerous examples of authenticated Coptic sculpture have been created from Egyptian limestone, which carves easily but is prone to extreme weathering, leaving surviving works damaged or even unrecognizable. The recumbent lion sculpture in the Nadler collection presents the extreme weathering, untouched patina, and imprecise carving that an authentic work of Coptic art would have if it weren't recut or restored. The amenable quality of material and imitable style of Coptic sculpture has led to many works being recut or carved anew into old limestone blocks of the period to enhance the value of the works. However, these works do not best reflect the culture of people from late antiquity, as they are modern interpretations of art from Coptic Egypt. The sculpture found and associated with the Shikabata group that is adorned with explicit Christian symbols does not reflect the architecture from its excavation site. No large ecclesiastical or Christian buildings are found at Shikabata or ancient Antinopolis, even though there were known Christian communities once located in the area. The inconsistencies between the Shikabata works and their surroundings, as well as the aesthetic differences with other Coptic sculpture, reinforces their status of forgery. However, they were perceived as evidence for large-scale sculpture in Coptic Egypt, and in the eyes of many art historians, appeared to provide a bridge between the pagan and Christian cultures, causing them to assume a prominent role in scholarly literature. The Nadler sculpture, Female Figure Holding a Wreath, showcases a figure nearly removed from its relief background and displayed as a sculpture in the round. The sculpture's formulaic features match Donald B. Spaniel's description of the first category of unauthentic works in the Shikabata group. These features include a large rounded head with a weak chin, outlined eye sockets and drilled pupils, deep nasolabial folds, and an archaic-like smile. The first subcategory of the Shikabata group, originally proposed by Gary Vacan, contains the most extensive collection of unauthentic sculptures identified as grave stelae. Some of the proposed works belonging to the first Shikabata group are imaginative reinterpretations of Coptic sculpture, while others often have attributes rooted in authentic motifs that have been reworked or recarved. The pose of the female figure holding a wreath is unconvincing, as her hand does not grip the laurel, but instead follows the curve of the wreath and rests before the object. Although the figure holding up the laurel wreath seems implausible, the pose of the sculpture appears in other perceived authentic examples of Coptic art. The catalog entry for the female figure holding a wreath in Modernism Foretold, the Nadler collection of late antique art from Egypt, compares the pose of the sculpture to that of a textile fragment in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. The fragment exhibits a figure believed to be Nike holding two wreaths or crowns raised in the air and level with the height of her head. The winged Victory in the textile fragment stands on a pillar exhibiting a similar laurel motif found in the wreath of the sculpture in the Nadler collection. The use of laurel in the sculpture has dual symbolism, as a reference to triumph and victory in both Christian and pagan traditions. In Christianity, laurel directly implies the resurrection of Jesus and his triumph over death, while the secular meaning is a more generalized understanding of victory and prosperity through a person's life. The deeply carved, pleated garment worn by the female sculptural figure may also serve as a modern reference to the Coptic motif of Nike. As the Modernism Foretold catalog entry states, the tunic's hemline stops mid-calf and an inappropriate length for women of the period, but possibly an interpretation of Nike Shaitan. Although the female figure holding a wreath does not exhibit explicit Christian imagery like crosses, and conceivably adopts its subject matter from pagan traditions, the sculpture conveys substantial aesthetic evidence that the figure is a modern recarving in Coptic limestone. The niche figure from the Nadler collection of Woman Holding a Cross presents similar formulaic facial features seen in female figure holding a wreath, and both sculptures display the similar single layer of circular curls with deep drill holes. Instead of adopting references from pagan traditions or secular motifs, the woman holding a cross displays the overt Christian symbol of a cross held in the left hand and a button cross recessed in the niche molding. The button cross located above the woman's head exhibits a Latin-style cross with a small circle in the middle. This type of cross was commonly added to forgeries to identify the works as Coptic and enhance their commercial value. A similar known Coptic forgery, Standing Woman, of a woman holding a cross in front of her waist belongs to the Brooklyn Museum of Art and has been referenced by Spaniel as belonging to the Shikabata group. The Standing Woman has the same deep pleated garment lines seen in both Nadler sculptures of women holding a cross and female figure holding a wreath. However, the hair of the Brooklyn Museum sculpture abandons the donut ring coiffure, opting for parallel stylized lines moving away from the figure's hairline. The rare sculpture in the round contrasts the two female figures in the Nadler collection, as the Standing Woman only exhibits carving on the figure's frontal features, while her back remains untouched, as if the artist was unable to conceivably portray a human's back. The unfinished quality of the sculpture from the Brooklyn Museum of Art proposes that the work is perhaps a creation of complete forgery, rather than a modern recarving of an existing work. The Nadler niche figure, woman holding a cross, likely reflects funerary portrait stela, produced to adorn burial temples during late antiquity and early Byzantium. The Brooklyn Museum of Art's collection of Coptic works includes a comparative sculpture, funerary stela with a male figure, of an oddly proportioned nude male wearing a laurel crown and holding a sprig of laurel in his right hand. As previously discussed, the significance of laurel has Christian connotation, but is likely used here as a pagan reference to the figure's victory or prosperity during his life. The Greek inscription located on the molding of the niche reads, Olympios, 28 years of age, or Olympio rides in the eternal life. According to the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the name Olympios suggests that the owner of the funerary stela was pagan. The young man is framed by two spiral columns with papyrus capitals supporting a gable to create a sanctuary for the deceased. This relief demonstrates how the late pagan iconographic tradition survived, as the young man's nakedness evokes the classical custom of heroic nudity. The Nadler collection's woman holding a cross stylistically contrasts the flat facial features, lack of carving distinction of fingers and toes, and state of surface wear seen in the niche figure from the Brooklyn Museum of Art. The funerary stela with male figure does exhibit an Ankh cross above the capital on the left. The inclusion of the cross likely indicates that the funerary stela was reused for a Christian burial tomb, unlike the Nadler collection's woman holding a cross, which was perhaps recarved during the modern era. The sculptures of female figure holding a wreath and woman holding a cross from the Nadler collection exemplify similar poses to the Detroit Institute of Art's sculptural relief of Saint holding a wreath. All three sculptures showcase comparable hairstyles consisting of curls created by drill holes, eyes comprised of concentric circles with drilled pupils, and deeply carved garments with parallel pleats. The saint holding wreath convincingly raises up the laurel wreath in one hand, while her other hand holds a button cross level with her stomach, a combination of the actions exhibited by the Nadler collection sculptures. These works with funerary associations display overt Christian iconography and share stylistic similarities with the Shikabata group, indicating the invention and portrayal of Coptic sculpture through the lens of modern artisans. The last work of interest, Orant figure from the Nadler collection, provides a nice example of an obviously recarved Coptic sculpture. The figure holding his arms up in prayer or veneration is deeply recessed into a thick slab of ancient limestone. Similar to the female figure holding a wreath and woman holding a cross, the Ornat figure exhibits a drilled coiffure, large neck, and deep pleated garment. However, the limestone of the Ornat figure is strikingly white, and the composition is sunken into the relief slab as if the original facade was carved away. From the Ornat figure, we can better understand how an artisan might have followed the original composition of a sculpture to improve the quality of the work and enhance its value. Like the previously discussed sculptures from the Nadler collection, the Ornat figure does not represent the expected style and appearance of authentic Coptic work found in late antique Egypt, but instead presents a modern interpretation of the period. The Christian iconography found in not fully authentic Coptic works establishes a retrospective view of the culture and religion of Egypt during the late antiquity period. After the conversion of Constantine and during the rise of Christianity, the governing elite remained rooted in their Hellenic identity by surrounding themselves with images depicting literary and mythological scenes. The 4th to 7th century workshops in Egypt produced reliefs, tomb decorations, sculptures, paintings, and textile works that showcased a marriage between the patron's respect for classical culture and the practiced religion of Christian clientele. The work of forgeries are modern interventions with overt Christian imagery, signifying the art was made after the religion progressed throughout Egypt, when images such as crosses or laurel wreaths became important iconographic symbols. Museums have collected numerous works under the impression they are authentic, only to later discover the art is a creation of deception or forgery. It would be unreasonable to expect a museum to discount a work collected under false pretenses and acquired by museum funds. Instead, with careful curation, forgeries and fakes could potentially help develop a visitor's understanding of a period, culture, or people by offering a comparison to fully authenticated art. The Brooklyn Museum of Art held an exhibition from February 13th to May 10th in 2009, titled Unearthing the Truth, Egypt's Pagan and Coptic Sculpture, which directly addressed the issue of authenticity by displaying known Coptic forgeries and the same show as authenticated Coptic works. The exhibition of 31 Coptic limestone sculptures were organized and displayed based on their status of authenticity. Objects that were recognized forgeries or believed to be modern recarvings of ancient Egyptian limestone were showcased in a gallery with white walls and white vitrine bases. The sculpture works with verified provenance or believed by the museum to be authentic were presented in a gallery with black walls and black display cases. Among the works used as examples of authenticated sculpture, the top of a late antique Egyptian limestone arch presents pagan iconography of a nymph riding a sea monster. In the next gallery, a viewer could compare the figure riding a nymph to the plastic, elastic-looking limestone sculpture of the paralytic rising from his bed, belonging to the Sheikh Abada group. The paralytic rising from his bed depicts the biblical scene of the New Testament Gospels where Christ performs the miracle of healing a paralyzed man and telling him to pick up his mat and walk, for his sins are forgiven. The modern forgery of the paralytic man has the concentric drilled eyes, patterned hair, and wide neck seen through the Sheikh Abada group. The curator's juxtaposition of authentic works with pagan motifs and the unauthentic works depicting Christian scenes allows a viewer to understand the retrospective view an artisan adopted to present the modern recut sculptures with Coptic identity. The exhibition consisted of 3 galleries, one of authenticated works, one of perceived forgeries, and the last that were recut during the 20th century. The last gallery was titled True or False and was comprised of works that had unusual iconography that did not fit within the gallery of fully authenticated works or forgeries. Museum visitors were tasked with determining whether they would place these objects within their own understanding of Coptic art based on what they examined in the other 2 galleries. By exhibiting these works with legitimacy in mind, the curators created an opportunity for visitors to distinguish between what the museum considers authenticated objects from the recut sculptures that cloud the canon of Coptic art. In an art gallery, a curator is able to develop careful comparisons that differentiate forgeries and true Coptic objects to ensure that a visitor gains an understanding of the period, people, and region. In a world where we have become dependent on information in the palm of our hands, museums now must consider how to create these divisions between the standard of Coptic art and modern reproductions within their online collection databases. Although the distinctions of the genuine and false works have been addressed in scholarship of Coptic art, a Google search for Coptic sculpture still yields results with a mixture of true Coptic works, forgeries, and modern recarvings. Research studies have determined how a museum's online presence complements the educational experience of visiting a physical gallery by providing an at-home database to further examine a museum's collection. Through online catalog entries, a museum could potentially help rectify the misrepresentation of early Christian Egypt and its arts by clarifying and defining the status of authenticity for Coptic sculptures in their collection. Looking at two screen grabs of digital collection entries for Coptic sculptures, one from the Brooklyn Museum of Art and the other from the Detroit Institute of Arts, one can see how a lack of clarity regarding the status of authenticity creates confusion and ultimately misrepresents late antique Coptic sculpture. Both of these sculptural reliefs are examples of Coptic art with questionable identity and possible recarving. The relief of Hercules smiting Achelous in the form of a bull was presented in the Gallery of Unauthentic Works at the Brooklyn Museum of Art for its interesting layers of carving. While the sculpture of the saint holding a from the Detroit Institute of Arts has the formulaic features and overt Christian iconography of the Che Guevara group. However, neither online collection entries considers or questions the authenticity of these works. Instead, the entries place the sculptures between a definite range of dates and within a region of Coptic Egypt where they are believed to have originated. Although neither of these works have been definitively marked as forgeries, museum collections could help to alleviate the confusion of the Coptic art canon among the digital visitors by briefly addressing the work's status of authenticity. Unfortunately, with the increase of interest in Coptic art during the mid-20th century, artisans took advantage of the surge by introducing numerous recut sculptures to the art market. Collectors did not question the authenticity of the works as there was little related scholarship at the time that they were acquired, and modern recut sculptures appear to be great examples of Coptic art. However, the issue now is how do we treat and respond to the unauthentic examples of Coptic sculpture that populate the numerous museum vaults? With careful curation, attention to authenticity, and comparison between genuine works and modern recut sculptures, the not fully authentic works can establish the true canon of the Coptic period, where pagan and Christian traditions collided. Although unauthentic works claiming to be Coptic art adopt a retrospective view of the period, the sculptures could be used as a comparison or contradictory example of how pagan motifs and symbols were preferred in the authentic works. Through careful exhibitions and detailed digital catalogs, museum and curators can present not fully authentic works to viewers and help viewers examine the differences between genuine Coptic art and their modern recut counterparts. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, for your paper on this very important subject. The two papers that we just heard, of course, are linked with these issues of the reception of Coptic art for artists, art critics, and art historians. And it shows us that Coptic art had a much bigger role, especially in the 20th century, than we generally recognize, and situating even the forgeries within these terms is important to understand, to do. So I thank you both for that. We are going to welcome questions now, of course. As we wait for them to come in, I will ask a couple of my own. Since Charlotte just spoke, I think I'll start with her. This explosion of forgeries after World War II to meet this new demand, we look at them now and, there's some, I mean, hindsight is 20/20, of course, but there are some kind of odd things about them. And you mentioned that there was very little to compare them to when they came onto the scene. However, at the same time, it seems like art historians were really ready to accept them. Like they were just like, yes, those are definitely real. So I would ask you if you could explain what you think about that. And then on the other hand, why was there a need to give them such a Christian identity? Like, why did they have to be Christian? They could have recarved late antique subjects. They could have refined them. They could have, tried to brush them up and make them more presentable, but there was a deliberate attempt to make even pagan things Christian. And I know you addressed some of that, but if you could further clarify, that would be great.
Yes, so one of the reasons I think that these were so easily accepted among art historians and collectors is because with the fashion of collecting Coptic art and with the interest, I definitely think people wanted to get their hands on what they thought were authentic Coptic sculpture. And so this kind of explosion into the market would allow them to have access to these sculptures that might not have been as readily available or able to be purchased. And as for the Christian iconography, I definitely think, for one, it's a retrospective view of trying to sum up the period and the Christian tradition of Coptic Egypt. But I also think that they might have gained some popularity because Christianity was so widespread and accepted among the collectors and those who would have welcomed these objects into their museum collections. And so they kind of speak to both the cultural moment in which they were collected, but also this retrospective view of what they were trying to sum up in Egypt.
Thank you. Lacy, I am not a modernist, so of course my question is going to be perhaps a little bit, I don't know, vague or something, but it seems like this Coptic art factors into this larger picture of, in the art world, of abstract expressionism versus expressionism, or, people who abstract expressionism in terms of the rejection of figural art, and how many artists thought that was kind of a solipsistic or exercise in ego, that they really had strong opinions against abstract expressionism. And I wonder if Coptic art had, especially for those people who were embracing figural, the figural arts as expression or just representational arts as used it as, I don't know, kind of a justification or some kind of proof that they were right, or if it was some kind of part of like some bigger argument.
I think it certainly provided a historical justification, because I think the criticism against abstract expressionism usually came in kind of two different ways. So one was kind of how you described, it was seen as very much about the artist and not as much about the art. They kind of complained about repetitive forms that a certain artist would use in multiple works to kind of set up their own career and their own style. So it seemed like that took away from the individual works because it was more about creating the artist's style. And then there is this other interpretation, which is kind of parallel to this prevailing idea that Noah discussed when it comes to Coptic art, which is that the artist simply was not skilled or not intelligent enough to come up with something that is representative of life visually. So yeah, I think there's kind of a tie there in the response, and maybe, the modernists were responding to that, but I do think it was more so they felt a need to find a historical precedent to kind of validate their current aesthetic concerns that were seen as unskilled or kind of more reflecting the artist and not anything for the sake of the viewer or for the subject. So yeah, I think you're right on it.
That's nice to hear. We have a question for Lacy. Given the emphasis on flatness in this period and given the challenge this concept poses for those interested in figuration, textiles which conjure the body but without its attendant volume seem especially suggestive. Do you see textiles as uniquely or effectively reconciling modernism and figuration?
Well, it's interesting because Hartley, in that the quote that I read from him, he describes the textiles as paintings. So there seems to be a direct correlation between the texture of the weave and the texture of the paint, which you'd think would kind of go against the idea of flatness, which of course Greenberg would attribute medium specificity in painting, but you see the same flatness in Coptic textiles. So yeah, there is kind of a tension between flatness and figuration, which would be these kind of 3D forms, which I think through the use of those like black outlines that we see in Matisse's work and in Hartley's work, I think that's kind of how they deal with that. You know, instead of seeing geometric blobs of color, it forms kind of an image that can still use that kind of expressive color without being too illusionistic. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I guess how do you think, Lacy, that this, what Gaillet and Hartley are doing so early, how do you think this helps us understand the reception of Coptic art later in the century, in the 20th, especially in the United States? Do you think it has some kind of, I don't know, foresight or an early representation of this, or what do you think?
I think in general, when we look at Coptic art, you know, sometimes it's very easy to see something modern, to read kind of something modernist into it because the visuals seem similar to our understanding of modern art. And that's kind of paired with a lack of understanding of Coptic art and of late antique art in general. So I think instead of trying to understand Coptic art within its own context, within its own purposes, it's easier to kind of see it through a modernist lens and have our own interpretations on it. And I think that especially happens after this like Coptomania craze. And when it does become fashionable to collect Coptic art, I think our reception of Coptic art completely changes, and it becomes often less about Copts or Coptic artists or late antique art, and it becomes more about foretelling contemporary aesthetics.
Very nice, thank you. Trying to think if I have another question for Charlotte. It was very difficult, I can tell you from my experience working with these objects, to understand what they might have originally been intended to be. And I think you did a nice job kind of tracing those things along, but what do you, I mean, you have kind of pointed out in your presentation the Detroit example, which I also bring up in the catalog because they don't say anything about it. And so how do you see having that kind of better transparency or better awareness affecting, I don't know, I mean, not just because of its misrepresentation, but do you see it becoming kind of recontextualized in a way that's helpful to understand something, you know, maybe it's 20th century modernism, maybe it's shown, like, how would you reconfigure this kind of thing?
I definitely think that transparency would at least help to create kind of a comparison or even maybe like contradictory examples. And I think that they're still relevant because, like the Detroit example, it's based in motifs that were present in Coptic art. So it's not like these are completely imaginative or out of creativity, or they're based within the tradition of Coptic art. And so I think that they can help, you know, kind of recontextualize what we know as this authenticated Coptic sculpture and what it would have looked like, especially how it kind of created this marriage between both Christian traditions and pagan traditions. And so these examples of forgeries can now be used and in a transparent way to create this kind of canon of Coptic art, what we know, what's still missing, how we can read the canon of Coptic art and better our understanding of what the tradition might have been.
We have a lot of catching up to do in Coptic art history in general, not to mention dealing with this issue, which is substantial. Charlotte, thank you for this paper. How large of a problem do you think this is? Do you have ballpark sense of numbers of these, recarved or complete forgeries that are in museum collections?
So I know the Brooklyn Museum of Art has a lot of what are now fully deemed as Coptic forgery or modern recarvings. In that one exhibition, there were 31 Coptic sculptures, and I think about half of them had some kind of modern intervention. And so a lot of it comes from the range of forgery or modern intervention. There are some Coptic works that are fully authenticated, have not been touched, and there are others that have a kind of a mixture of modern carving or recarving, and then there are works that are created fully out of this new idealized creation. And so that would have been like the paralytic man rising from his bed, that has very little reference in Coptic tradition, overtly Christian, and referencing a story that was a part of the New Testament. And so I think the problem is not so much of how many works are in each collection, but the status of authenticity. So how recarved is the work, how much has been a modern interpretation of Coptic art, and how we can kind of fit that within the canon of tradition.
That's a large project there. So here's a question for Lacy. I also wonder if Coptic art being seen and interpreted in Hartley's and others' work, including Avery, who was allied with the abstract expressionist group, may be seen as even another source in the pictographic art of Gottlieb and even maybe 1940s pre-color fields of Rothko. This is a loaded question. This is like, you have to know all these artists and you need to answer them all. Maybe, well, it is your professor, I will admit that. Maybe abstract expressionism and Coptic art collecting is not as separate as the organizers of the 1960s show thought. Very good question.
I mean, that question makes a very good point in and of itself. I'm not sure how to fully respond to it because it's expanded upon my work in a very good way. That's definitely a way to expand upon my current research and move it farther in kind of the historical timeline, because I do think that's true, that Coptic art has a larger influence than even just, one artist or a couple of artists who we can directly track back to Gaillet, which is, very helpful for my paper, but doesn't necessarily reflect the entirety of, the influence of Coptic art. So yeah, I think that is definitely a way that I could expand upon my research that definitely still has legs for me to work with.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, and Dr. Simon says, yes, it's more of a comment and suggestion. Thank you for that. So I will, I guess I'm in charge of letting us all go. I would very much like to thank all the people who attended today and for spending the time with us. And thank you, of course, to the speakers for their immense efforts, for all their hard work and all the research they did that contributed to our understanding of this remarkable collection of art from the Nadlers. Okay, thank you very much.